Before we get started with today's show, I'd like to say that Tales from the Backlog is a listener-supported podcast, and some personal heroes of mine like Chris Nelson, the Top 3 Podcast crew, Zulgeek, Colby Moyer, Eric Guess, Rick Firestone, Jill, Kieran, ZNA, Cupcake, Kyle, Christian S., Matt, aka Stormageddon, JD, and many more have all chosen to support the show by going to patreon.com/RealDaveJackson. As little as $2 per month will get you voting on episode topics, some bonus episodes every now and then, and other cool treats. Once again, that's patreon.com/RealDaveJackson. Any and all support is always appreciated. On to the show. Hey everybody, my name is Dave Jackson, and you're listening to Tales from the Backlog. This is a video games review podcast where each week I'm joined by a guest to bring a game out of the backlog, talk about our experiences today. But I'm joined by two wonderful guests today, friends of the show, immortal heroes facing the calamity, and the two hosts of the Pre-Order Bonus podcast, Cameron Warren and Jacob Price. Welcome to the show, my guys.
How's it going?
Thanks for having us. We're so excited to be here.
Yeah, this is great. This is a big episode, and I'm very happy to have you guys here. We're going to talk about Breath of the Wild today, but before we get into Breath of the Wild, I want to give you the customary time at the beginning of the episode. If people are not familiar with the Pre-Order Bonus podcast, tell everybody what it's all about.
Go for it, Jake.
The Pre-Order Bonus podcast, what we do is we like to have a really analytical approach to video games. And so each episode, or typical episode, will be based on a game, whether when we played from the past or one that's currently, people are talking about for whatever reason. And we break them down according to 4 categories. We talk about the narrative, mechanics, gameplay loop, and then we speculate and talk about the impact on the industry. So we like using sort of these categories to framework like how we're going to talk about games, and to really dig deep into what a game has to offer, things that we really liked about certain games, and to sort of just go deep. We like to go deep in each of our episodes.
Yeah. It's not unlike this show, right? It's every episode is a different game, or sometimes, like you guys recently at the time of recording put out a little developer interview that was a lot of fun to listen to. So I love listening to your show. I love the approach that you guys take. And any podcast who does like a weekly or, semi-weekly show talking about specific games, giving it that deep, thoughtful analysis, I'm all about it. I like what you guys are doing.
Thank you. Yeah, it's so much fun. Yeah, that's, I guess, the other thing that we do is every now and then we get these, we call them the Game Maker series, where we try to do short interviews with devs. And it's pretty awesome. After every single episode we've done, every interview, the dev has said, "Thank you for keeping this short." Right, Cameron? Would you say that's true?
Yeah, I mean, we do try and keep it to a tight 30 minutes, partially because we're both lazy, and, but also because, yeah, it gives us like that out of like, oh, we're like the short podcast, so you only have to spend 30 minutes with us. Although we've had a couple where we've gone over and we're like, oh shoot, we have like a lot more to talk about, but
yeah,
we still ended on time.
Well, I'm going to go ahead and break the short podcast thing here. This is not a short podcast, and especially with the game that we have today, which is The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild, which is an action-adventure game developed and published by Nintendo for the Wii U and the Switch in 2017. Some elevator pitches if you're listening to the show and you're not familiar with Breath of the Wild. I'm saying that this is Zelda goes open world and radically shakes up the long-established formula for the series. Cameron, how about you?
I say Breath of the Wild is a master class in survival light mechanics and a physics sandbox, but wrapped in a Zelda skin.
Absolutely. Jake, how about you?
Link takes a breather before giving Zelda a break. This, of course, coming on the longstanding joke that Breath of the Wild is this absolutely massive game. And from the get-go, there's this sense of urgency that, hey, Zelda's been doing this thing for 100 years. Why don't you help her out? And you're like, you know what? I think I'm actually going to go gather 100 apples right now.
Right. And kind of along those lines, you're going to spend a lot of time gathering those apples and stuff. This is a long game, so I want to talk about playtime just for a second. My first time playing the game, I played on Wii U. It's hard to say because I don't have that Wii U anymore, but this was well over 100 hours for me playing. I replayed it recently to A, get ready for this show, but B, kind of get ready for Tears of the Kingdom. This was 40 hours for me on Switch. Again, like, I did all the main stuff, of course. I beat the game. I did some optional stuff. Still 40 hours. So long game. Jake, how about you?
I put down here 90 plus hours. My first playthrough, probably 70, maybe a little more than that. And it's wild. On my first playthrough, for example, I didn't even know about Terrytown. We'll talk about that later, but I feel like I still missed a ton of content. And then I did a second playthrough where I was trying to challenge myself, where I'd only invest in stamina instead of hearts. And I got about 15 hours, 2 bosses into that one before I gave up. And then 5+ hours horsing around trying to replicate speedrunning tricks. Breath of the Wild has a freaking awesome speedrunning community, and the routes that they've established are just so mind-blowing. And because the physics sandbox is so good, I was like, I got to see if I can do some of these.
Yeah,
they're really hard,
absolutely.
by the way.
Yeah, we're going to talk about the potential for that stuff later, for sure, but kind of little tease at the beginning of the episode. Cameron, how about you? Playtime in Breath of the Wild?
Yeah, I think I put around 60 hours on the Wii U. I noticed, Dave, you're a fellow Wii U Breath of the Wild player, which we're of a rare kind.
So rare.
I actually played that game on the Wii U. It's actually, I feel like there's a running joke in the gaming industry, like nobody played that game on Wii U. We exist. So.
There's
and it's the majority here. I'd like to point out that the majority of people here played this on Wii U.
Oh yeah,
the majority. Yes, that's right. Yeah, I put in like 60 on the Wii U and another probably. I just checked my timer, like another 40 on the Switch. So like 100 in total. But funny enough, never actually beat the game. I'll just toss that out there. I put that many hours and never went and fought Ganon, which is just don't know why. But I could, we can analyze that.
It's like Skyrim.
Yeah. Well, there's a lot to keep you occupied. And if you're listening to this episode and you have not played Breath of the Wild, the spoiler policy for this episode is the same one we do on every episode of the show. It's a no spoiler breakdown for a while. And then there's going to be a spoiler wall you can check down in the show notes for a timestamp for exactly when to stop listening if you don't want to be spoiled on Breath of the Wild. So let's get into our histories with the game, with the Zelda series. Guests will always go first in this section. So Jake, how long have you been playing the Zelda games? What brought you to Breath of the Wild? Why did you want to play this?
I mean, I was first introduced to the Zelda series with a lot of people from our generation, Ocarina of Time. So late 90s, I'm a pretty young kid. Now growing up, we didn't have an N64. Our first console was actually a PS1. So I grew up playing like Ocarina of Time and Majora's Mask in spurts, like at friends' houses, right? I played a lot of Game Boy, and I remember when A Link to the Past with 4 Swords added onto it was released for Game Boy Advance, if I'm not mistaken. And so that was my first game in the series that I beat start to finish on my own. It was the first Zelda game I actually owned. And to this day, it's still my favorite Zelda game. I try at least every year to play through it once as sort of like, this is like, I don't know, my gaming ritual, if you will. I love A Link to the Past. And then since then, I just play Zelda, mostly mainline games when I get a chance. In high school, I finally bought an N64. I put this in here because this is so hard to believe. I bought an N64 and Ocarina of Time for $25 off of somebody.
Yeah. That's before the retro prices got fucking out of control.
Yeah. I mean, I was looking, just you can't get that stuff for $25 these days. And I played the game a ton. I probably 100% of that game in some capacity at this point. But yeah, since then, like my console gaming has been I have a really weird and long history on that. But eventually, I played pretty much all of the mainline games with the exception of Wind Waker and Skyward Sword. And so when Breath of the Wild was coming around, when those trailers were first coming out, I didn't have a Switch or a Wii U, but I was like, okay, I have to play this game. It just looks too good.
Right on. Cameron, how about you?
Yeah, so I mean, Ocarina of Time is one of my favorite games of all time. I think that's sort of my gaming coming out. Like that's the game that made me realize that, like, oh man, I really like video games. Like these are cool. Yeah, and just had some magical moments with that game, and then Majora's Mask as well. And then I kind of fell off the series for a long time. I dabbled in Twilight Princess and in Skyward Sword, both of which I didn't finish, just like didn't pull me in the same. I mean, I always loved like the Zelda lore and the Zelda kind of world building. I always thought it was like really fun, but just never finished those games for some reason. And then, you know, obviously had my eye on just gaming in general, and the Breath of the Wild trailers were just some of the best, probably some of the best to this day. I think that second Breath of the Wild trailer was just like an incredible trailer. Like that thing slapped so hard that I was like, oh my gosh, like I'm back in. Like I'm so back in. And just kind of everything they did to present it. And then so I was in from day one, pre-ordered on the Wii U, got my hard copy, and yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, I'm kind of like you guys. One of my first ones for the Zelda series was Ocarina of Time, but my first one was Link's Awakening on the Game Boy. And I was a huge Zelda fan all through Ocarina, Majora's Mask, and Twilight Princess. I'm actually always like one generation behind playing these like cross-generation Zelda games. I played Twilight Princess on the GameCube, and then I played Breath of the Wild on the Wii U. But kind of like Cameron, like I kind of fell off. I hated Skyward Sword when it came out. I really disliked that game. The motion controls just really bugged me. I hate motion controls in general. And the fact that I had to do them in Skyward Sword really bugged me. So then it's a little more of like a personal story here. Like I was living overseas. I just moved overseas to Korea. In 2015, I moved. And I didn't play video games for a couple of years. Like I played Xenoblade Chronicles over the course of like 2 years. And that was kind of like all I played. I was just doing other stuff. And I kind of got this feeling like maybe I'm done playing video games. I'll sell the Wii U. I'll sell my Xbox 360. I had an entire carry-on bag when I moved. I was allowed to take 2 suitcases and a carry-on bag, and my carry-on bag was just video game consoles. That's how much like
nice.
I thought those were important to me. And then I was like, you know what? I think I'm done. And then I was just kind of like heard. I didn't see the trailers for Breath of the Wild. I didn't know there was a new game coming out. I just like heard there's a new Zelda game. Someone at work maybe mentioned it or something. And I was like, you know what? One more Zelda game. Be like the last game I play before I sell all this shit and move on. And if you're listening to this podcast, you know that's not how things turned out, because this game completely reinvigorated my love of video games. Like brought me all the way back in. And it's a good kind of transition to get into just some quick opening introductory thoughts about this game. The first time I played this was like immediate, this is the best game I've ever played type of territory. The first time. Then I replayed it in the last couple months. And I started to get the feeling like, oh, this like, it started with like, oh, this isn't quite as good as I remember. Like, I don't really like the combat a whole lot, and the shrine puzzles are super simple, and I still hate the divine beasts and stuff like that. But I came out of replaying the entire game with this feeling like, no, this is one of the best games I've ever played. It's so much greater than the sum of its parts that like when I kind of itemize and say like, oh, this is good, this is bad, this kind of sucks, this is okay. It's like not that good on paper, but when I play it, it's magical. I couldn't stop playing it. I was intending to dip in and just kind of like play the Great Plateau and refresh before the recording, because I can look up the story of this game. It's like a paragraph long, right?
Yeah.
But I couldn't stop playing it, and I just played all the way till the end, and I still just have, this game will always have a special place in my heart, despite some things that I think are fair criticisms about the gameplay and stuff like that. So it's a magical game for me. I'm really looking forward to talking with you guys about what it is that like gives it that quality for me personally. But yeah, I'll turn it over to you guys to see your thoughts. Cameron, how about you?
When I played this, I think the Great Plateau, like beginning portion of this game is might be my number one game of all time. Like specifically the Great Plateau, but like the beginning of the game. I think the first 3 hours are just impeccably crafted. Like, yeah, it's essentially, the Great Plateau is essentially like a mini version of the entire map on that one like little location. And I think that introduction to the game just absolutely floored me. And it actually, as great as everything else was, it actually just went downhill from there for me. Because I think some of the other elements, like the boss fights, like the larger dungeons, like the Divine Beast, areas, some of those things like didn't really, and the story overall like didn't really hit for me. But at the time, and I think Elden Ring has sort of surpassed this in some ways. But at the time, like that wonder and magic and the exploration of that world was like an uncomparable experience. And that's kind of why, back to my earlier comment, kind of why I never beat it, because I literally spent all my time just exploring the map and finding cool stuff. And I did all the Divine Beast, and I was like, you know what? Like, I'm good. I don't need to go fight another, boring boss. I kind of explored this world and got what I wanted out of it. I'm just gonna kind of leave it there, which I know is like probably super weird, but that's kind of what happened.
Yeah, well, if you got what you wanted to get out of the game and you're happy with just putting it down, then I mean, we all should be more like that when we're like, you know what, I'm satisfied. I'm not gonna keep playing this game to completion if I don't want to, But so, Jake, opening thoughts about Breath of the Wild.
I loved this game when it came out, and I think it was like a flawless game for me. Just, I guess, to talk a little bit more about my experience actually playing this game. In 2017, when this came out, I didn't have a Switch, and I did not have the means to buy a Switch, but we used to my wife and I did babysitting swaps with another couple. So like one of us would go over there and watch their kids while they went out on a date, and then like we'd switch every week or something like that. And they bought a Switch, and the guy was like, dude, you got to try Breath of the Wild. I was like, sure, of course. Their kids were asleep, and so I booted it up. And so over the course of like 2 weeks, I think I did the Great Plateau experience. And I thought, I was like, wow, this game is incredible. And then I realized that there was probably an infinite amount of game afterwards. And so that Great Plateau moment for me was like, I have to play this game and have to play it to completion at some point. And the funny thing is that eventually I did, but I did it on a Switch Lite, which I think is probably the worst way to play this game. I would just highly recommend you don't play. Like, the controls are too small. I would say for a world so big to fit in such a tiny screen really sucked. But yeah, I've been booting it up, knowing that we're coming on to do this episode. And okay, 6 years later, I can have a little more nuance in how I'm looking at this game. Yeah, it does have some flaws, right? And I think part of that is there's just kind of an uneven experience across bosses and shrines. And I think with the shrines, when you've got as many as there are in that game, of course, there's going to be some unevenness. But like the motion control stuff, for example, like, you know, like the ball in the maze, and then you have to like rotate it right. Like that kind of stuff always drove me bonkers. But I would say like the core aspect of the game, like every time I've booted it back up, it has the it factor, right? There's so much about it that's enjoyable. The physics sandbox that is the game, I think it's just has not been met since then. I can't think of another game. Maybe like Control, right, is another game where you can sort of screw around in what the game allows you to do, and it's still like pretty remarkable. But yeah, then there's one section in the game we're going to talk about in the spoiler that if I had to hate any aspect of this game, it was this one section of this game that I really despised. But the rest of the game is just so much fun. And let's see, the last thing I have in the notes here is, why are the controls so weird?
Yeah.
Like, coming back to this, I'm like, the controls are so funky. They're so weird. Why? Why did we allow this?
Why is the jump button X on the Switch? It doesn't make any sense. Like, it's the only game I've played in a long time that has that. But yeah, let's take a little music break. When we come back, we're gonna set up the story and then dive into that gameplay. So in Breath of the Wild, you begin, this is like a hard reset. It feels like Nintendo took all the criticism from Skyward Sword and how handholdy and talky that game was. And they're like, you know what? Fuck it, you're off. We're not telling you anything. And the game opens with Link waking up. You do a extremely small, short tutorial. It teaches you how to jump and climb, and that is it. And you walk out and it has this beautiful moment. I mean, it almost brought me to tears when I was replaying it. Again, like, this game means a lot to me. When you walk out and you're in a cave at the beginning, so you walk out and you see the full landscape and the piano and the music rises and it shows you the title card and stuff. It makes an incredible introduction. And then when you do get into the gameplay and into the Great Plateau, that introduction to the game continues. You meet a man outside by a fire who tells you what's been going on. So 100 years ago, the kingdom of Hyrule fell to the calamity Ganon, of course, in The Legend of Zelda. And Hyrule is kind of a post-apocalyptic wasteland now, kind of. There's still people out there living and congregating at stables for some reason, but there's not a whole lot of life out in the world other than plants and stuff and some animal life. Hyrule Castle is enshrouded in this black and red smoke, which is the monster Calamity Ganon that's overtaken it. Zelda is out there holding Calamity Ganon kind of in check and has been for the last 100 years. And it's your job to power up with your singular objective to go destroy Calamity Ganon. But before you can, and we're just going to drop the story there, we'll pick it back up in the spoiler section. Before you can go fight Ganon, unless you're a speedrunner, you're going to have to play the game for a while to power up. So this is the bread and butter. This is where we're going to spend the most time in this episode, I feel like, talking about what it's like to play this game. So it is an open world. It is a huge open world. It is much bigger than it initially presents to you. And this has kind of become a shorthand for me personally. Both of you guys played Elden Ring, I think, right?
Yeah.
Yes.
So that moment happens in Elden Ring too, where you start the game and you're like, oh, pretty big open world, right? And then it expands to like 8 times the size of what you thought it was. That's become a shorthand, call it a Great Plateau moment for me, because once you're done and you're set loose, it is just incredibly big. And a little note here that Monolith Soft, makers of Xenoblade Chronicles, among other stuff, were brought in to assist with landscape and topography design for this open world. And I think it really shows. Like, Cameron, you mentioned, I think, that the open world was unparalleled at the time, in a landscape with, Assassin's Creed games and Far Cries and stuff like that. That is kind of like anonymous open world design. And then you get into this game that just feels so crafted and thoughtful, you know?
Yeah, again, and I have to caveat at the time because Elden Ring has surpassed, I think, again, and I say in some ways because I think the exploration has been overcome by Elden Ring. Like, what they did in terms of making that world interesting to look at and to find things in is unparalleled, I think. But at the time, Breath of the Wild did that. And then when you mix in kind of that combination of like the survival light elements and like the cooking and, the sliding on your shield and the physics elements and and obviously the gliding with the glider, which is just so, I mean, what better feeling is there than jumping off like a high point in that game and just gliding down to some random location that you haven't been before? Just like that feeling was just unparalleled. And so I think the combination of all those elements just made that open world just so compelling to look around at. And the game rewarded you. I think the key piece is here is the game rewarded you for doing that by giving you interesting, cool stuff to find in basically every corner that you looked, which is pretty exceptional. And what was better about that versus other open worlds, I think, that had been done before is, like Assassin's Creed being a great example, is those games didn't really reward you for looking around, just going and kind of doing what you wanted. Those games rewarded you for checking boxes on icons on a map, which is a different kind of game. It's not a bad game. But what Breath of the Wild introduced with just looking around, which I think Skyrim also does some of that without some of the physics and interesting things that Breath of the Wild does. But yeah, it just did that better than anyone else. And it just made it magical.
Mm-hmm.
I've got a lot of opinions on Breath of the Wild's open world, believe it or not.
No.
You never.
Not this guy.
Not this guy again. Yeah. Breath of the Wild's open world, I think, is the most, to my knowledge, extreme example of an open world. Now, I agree that I think that Elden Ring's open world is on the same level as Breath of the Wild. So, like, in terms of what it's accomplishing with the basic goals of how we understand what an open world is and how you engage with it. Now, the reason why I think that Breath of the Wild's openness is still so extreme is that there is really nothing stopping you from going from one place to another, right? There's really nothing stopping you from going straight to Calamity Ganon and initiating that fight right off the bat. And any percent speedrunner of the game will tell you that you can do that in under 20 minutes. You can beat the game.
And not through, like, just real quick, you can do that, but not through like glitching your way into the final boss or something. You can literally just run, do the Great Plateau real fast, go to the castle, fight Ganon without cheating somehow,
Right. Yeah. And the only, I think, like, gate that there is in Breath of the Wild is the Great Plateau, right? Because the glider is locked to completing the Great Plateau, and those cliffs faces are high enough that if you jump down, you'll die. I think now in Elden Ring, it is quite similar, right? But there are more gates, I think, than just the one. So if we're just comparing, like, the number of gates to where you can actually go in Elden Ring versus where you can actually go in Breath of the Wild has one, right? And I do really love and I admire that so much about this game. And what is so dangerous, I think, with having that type of a risk in your game design is that you have got to make exploration worth it. Otherwise, people, like, not casual, I mean to include casual gamers, will even find shortcuts to get things done if something seems too big or too meaningless, right? And my least favorite criticism of Breath of the Wild's open world is that it is empty. And I'm sorry, I hate that term, right? What you really mean to say when you say an open world is empty is that it is lacking meaning or interaction. And I just have to say that Breath of the Wild's interface, like, literally with climbing, even the dreaded rain that we all hate when you're climbing, just going and hunting animals, chopping down trees, gathering resources. This world is chock full of meaning and interaction. Now, you might not find that super exciting. You might find it tedious, and I think that's fine, right? But to say that there's nothing in this world really, really just rubs me the wrong way. So this open world, the other thing that I absolutely love about it is that the landscaping feels so organic and so natural. And then I don't really like to drag games, but I'm sorry, it's going to happen. Exception here. This is exactly why I did not like Immortals Fenyx Rising. There's a lot that I like about Immortals Fenyx Rising, and it does borrow a lot from Breath of the Wild, but I felt like it is so obvious where the gates and checks are for your stamina and for the other survival light meters that are built into that game, that it felt like the game, literally, like, the landscape of the game was designed to be one giant puzzle. Whereas in Breath of the Wild, exploration was so uninhibited by, like, cliff faces and random channels and narrow valleys, etc., that you could just kind of go out in really any direction, and you can make it there on 3 hearts and 1 stamina wheel. You really can. It might take you a long time, but it is possible to do. And so I just think that this open world is absolutely fantastic. The last thing I'll say here is that I think that this open world is a masterclass of environmental storytelling. This is the land of Hyrule. It is very obviously moved on from the events of 100 years prior. Mm-hmm. Link and Zelda are memories, if they're remembered at all. And the world has moved on. And I just think that there's such a wonderful, it's kind of a mix. It's like a mix of a melancholy for a civilization that was lost 100 years ago, but also a rebirth or a spring of the communities that did survive the calamity from 100 years ago, and how they've flourished and developed their own cultures and their own way of life even 100 years out. And so I just think in terms of the way that they baked in the world building into the open world is really unsurpassed.
Yeah, I want to touch on that criticism that the open world gets for being empty, because this was something that I have also seen a lot. It's something that I thought, like, in the time between playing it for the first time and then kind of forgetting some stuff, 4 years later, and then replaying it. We did an episode on this show last summer about open worlds and like what makes a good open world and what makes a bad one. And we talked about like giving you a reason to explore, like giving me something when I explore. And Breath of the Wild does that. Every time you explore somewhere, you think, that looks cool. I bet you there's something up there. It might be a Korok, or it might be a shrine, but all of those things are helping you power up toward your ultimate goal of fighting Ganon at the end. And the other kind of conclusion we came to in that episode was, okay, if a game doesn't have meaningful rewards for exploration, make the act of moving through the world fun. And Breath of the Wild is super fun to climb and glide and all of that stuff. And I got almost the same fulfillment from like climbing up to the top of a mountain and overcoming that challenge, because you're governed by your stamina when you're climbing stuff. Maybe it starts raining and it's a challenge to get up to that top of the mountain. And like, so maybe I found a Korok and I go from having 6 Korok seeds to 7, and it's not a huge difference there. Well, guess what? I get to jump off that mountain and glide down wherever I want. And I find that to be personally really fulfilling and rewarding. So it hits on both of those axes, I think, even if you look at it and say like, oh, I'm not finding this amazing treasure every time I explore somewhere. I'm being rewarded in multiple ways. Like the act of moving is fun, and I'm probably finding something to help me power up kind of incrementally, Yeah.
Yeah. The last thing I'll say here is to bring in another game. And this is a game that I loved, was Death Stranding. And I know this turned off a lot of people, but I loved walking through that world because I had to think about it. And I think
me too.
If I didn't like Immortal Phoenix Rising, like their landscape design and how they decided to make puzzles out of it, I think Death Stranding is the polar opposite of that, where they actually made walking a puzzle that to me felt really enjoyable because it wasn't necessarily cumbersome. It was something that kept me engaged and kept me thinking about how I was interacting with the world instead of feeling like brick wall to brick wall to brick wall.
Yep.
I have the strong opinions out of Cameron and I on this. I've like written 5 essays probably in different chats about how I feel about Breath of the Wild.
What's funny is I always get the most crap on our podcast for being a Breath of the Wild shill, when I feel like I'm actually more critical of the game than Jake. Jake actually likes the game more than me.
Oh yeah, easily. I don't know why Cameron's, and to sort of, I don't think we've explained this joke, but in our podcast community, a lot of people don't like Breath of the Wild, and to the point where we made an emote for a Discord channel that's like anti Breath of the Wild. Cameron and I both really enjoy it, but I like it way more than Cameron. But Cameron's the lightning rod for criticism, whereas I get to sit in the back and eat popcorn every time Breath of the Wild comes up.
But I do like Breath of the Wild, but I do think, and if we're still on the topic of open world, I do think the story sucks.
Oh yeah, if we can bring it back around to that, I kind of agree. Like there's a Link has lost his memories, and so most of the story that you get in the game, like direct storytelling, is by kind of recovering these memories and watching flashbacks from the past and stuff. And those are not special to me in any way. The story that you get directly told by playing through the game is not super special in my opinion. I don't care about story in Zelda, and the good thing about Breath of the Wild, unlike fucking Twilight Princess, but also Skyward Sword, is if you're not into the story, you can just fuck off into the wilderness for 30 hours before someone talks to you again if you want to do it that way, you know? So that is a little like feather in the cap. I mean, it's faint praise to say that you can ignore something instead of saying that it's good, you know?
And I think it's tough. This is one of those tough conversations where it's like, you know, how do you make a great story that exists organically in an open world setting and also make the open world feel good, you know? But I think it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing to figure out, and it may just not be. I think it's good that they put their effort into other places. That being said, I'm definitely like a story gamer type person, and so that did fall flat for me, including the voice acting, which I just think is atrocious. I think it's the worst voice acting like ever. Literally,
it's I think that like the 5 or 6 main characters that you meet that have like full voice acting are fine, and Nintendo absolutely could have afforded better voice acting and better voice direction. The other characters that you meet that just have little like one-off lines are atrocious. It is like almost unforgivable to me that Nintendo, again, unlimited budget for a fucking Zelda game. And they're just like, you know, this sounds like we're pulling people off the street to go in when they talk to you.
Literally pulling people off the street. Like, where's the Nolan Norths and the what's his name? I mean, they could afford it. They could afford it.
Yeah.
Oh, the thing about story in open world games. I was thinking about The Witcher 3, which is a huge open world game, very long game, and a game that I think has good storytelling in it. And the way that I think The Witcher 3 does it in a good way is that your side quests have really good stories. The stuff that you're spending your time with when you're out exploring the open world have interesting stories. And like the main plot of The Witcher 3 is fine. It's nothing special in my opinion. But those side quests, those are great. And in Breath of the Wild, if we're talking about open world design and side quests, the side quests are also atrocious in this game. It's a lot of like, I need you to go find me 65 berries and bring them back to me because I need them. And my replay of this game, I did not do a single one of those side quests, and I was all the better for it.
That's a great skill to learn, Dave, is to learn that you can skip side quests that you don't want to do. I know it's really hard for people to understand that, but if you don't want to do a side quest, simply skip it.
Yeah, it's a side quest. It's optional by nature.
It's so funny because I feel like Zelda, I totally agree. I think the main story of Breath of the Wild is really straightforward. It's bare bones hero's journey, right? Stop the big bad. Let's, you know, maybe meet some friends along the way and let's get it done. But it's funny because I felt like there's some of the best writing actually in the Zelda series in Breath of the Wild. Just sort of the quippy, like the best humor. I think the humor of Breath of the Wild landed for me, right? Like you'd be going to, like, you're right. People are meeting up at stables. They've turned into some sort of like public house, you know, as well. And, some of the like conversations you would have with some of those people, they're, you know, it's just 2 or 3 lines or whatever. And sometimes I'd get caught off guard where it's like, this person will talk to me for quite a while, right? And you're just kind of going through dialogue quite a lot. And I thought like when the humor was used in like those little just conversations, it was probably the most that I've enjoyed a lot of Zelda writing. But I do agree that like, I guess what I'm coming at here is it's a bit of an uneven experience. Like, I think the environmental storytelling of this game is phenomenal. And I think some of the explanations that they give in game in some of the side areas of why and how people existed, you know, throughout these 100 years is super amazing. But but going for side quests, all the side quests just felt like that. Hey, can you go halfway across the planet to get me these items and then bring them back to me? And maybe I'll give you a rupee, right?
Yeah, you get 20 rupees.
Yeah, 20 rupees. And the funny thing is sometimes the game will make jokes about that too, right?
Yeah.
Like if you actually get all Korok seeds and give them to Hetsu, like I'm not going to spoil what he gives you. I haven't done this. I had to look it up, but it is very funny. And if you don't have the right sense of humor, you will not be laughing, right? So I just felt like the narrative experience is pretty uneven in some regards. Sometimes I fell in love like with what these NPCs were doing and saying, and other times I was like, no, this isn't going to happen.
Yeah, actually, one other thing about the storytelling in this game is that this is, to my knowledge, the only Zelda game where Link is not a silent protagonist. Link doesn't have voice acting, but Link does speak in the game. You pick dialogue options for Link when you're talking to people. Mm-hmm. And some of those were pretty funny to what you're saying there, Jake. You can kind of choose to role play a little bit just in how you talk to people, but Link can be kind of a dick, like a sarcastic dick if you want to. Or you can play it straight with, the classic Link is the hero type of thing. But I do agree that while I'm going to stop short of saying that this game has good writing, it did make me laugh a couple of times, which is not normally how I experience Zelda dialogue,
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I can agree with that.
Yeah. So Jake and I are back. Cameron had to jump off. Cameron had limited time to record with us today, but we appreciate Cameron's appearance on the show and taking the time to talk with us quite a bit. And you'll hear from Cameron when we give our final thoughts at the end of the non-spoiler section. Now, we talked about the open world. Now, let's talk about what you're doing in the open world. So, if you're not following the main quest, which we'll talk about that later, the bulk of your time is going to be exploring. And mostly, in my experience, looking for these shrines that are kind of dotted around the landscape. They stand out really well from the open world. You have these nature colors with the way that the world looks, and then you have these neon oranges that really pop from the landscape for a shrine that you haven't visited yet. So the shrines are kind of this game's replacement for dungeons in a way. Kind of, we have our bigger dungeons later, but then we have these small piece, like bite-sized dungeons here. So you find a shrine, you go inside, and it is usually a puzzle. And it might be one big puzzle. It might be like 2 or 3 puzzles of increasing complexity, but they're kind of bite-sized. And this is one of the things that I think is really great about this game, and in particular playing this game on the Switch, because I play handheld. This is how I play Switch. I don't plug it into my TV. I have the nice, larger Hori split pad controllers for my Switch, so I can play handheld without the fucking Joy-Cons. And one of the good things about these shrines is that they're short. You can do a shrine in 5 to 10 minutes. If you get stumped on the puzzle, it will take you 10 minutes, that kind of thing. And I'll get your opinion on this, Jake. I personally think that most of the shrine puzzles are fine. They're okay. I can't think of a single shrine puzzle where I was like, that was fucking awesome. Great puzzle. But they're okay. For the most part, I think.
Yeah, I would agree with there. I mean, there's 120 shrines in this game total?
120, yeah.
And there's just no way you're going to get a consistent level of quality across that many shrines, right? And what's remarkable to me is that there actually weren't as many combat-oriented shrines. Like you said, most of them are puzzle-based. And puzzles based around the physics of the game, which to me is holy cow. To sit down and try to think out that many puzzles seems pretty wild to me. But yeah, that's the thing is, and I totally agree with this, right? Where I can think of certain shrines puzzles that made me want to pull my hair out. But I can't, I'm really hard pressed to think of shrine puzzles that were extremely meaningful or ones that felt like they were done incredibly well or were, totally laden with aha moments, right? But yeah, for the most part, I mean, shrines, they were good. They did what they were supposed to do. They were extremely valuable, right? As a fast travel point, and then upon completion, just sort of the resource that you get for them, right? Yeah. Just they're super valuable. So I played, Breath of the Wild similarly to you, where that's how I spent most of my time. Was like, okay, how many pull up my map. Okay, I haven't really explored this area. There are probably a bunch of shrines over there. Let's go find them. and then
exactly
close my map, start trudging off in that area. And then thankfully you have like an indicator that beeps when a shrine is nearby. And for the most part, finding the shrine isn't too big of a hassle. Some of those shrines are buried though. And
it can be hard to find some of them, but most of them are just kind of sitting out. You may have to get a vantage point or a certain perspective in order to see them. But once you do see them, it's real straightforward to get to them most of the time. We said that most of them are puzzles. There's a couple, Jake, you mentioned this earlier, that use the gyro function on the Joy-Cons, or in my case, the Wii U gamepad. And these suck really bad. Man. First of all, so I was playing on Wii U, but I was playing with the Pro Controller because I'm not going to play with that gamepad in my hand for 100+ hours, when I'm playing on the TV. Yeah. So I was playing with the Pro Controller, but the Pro Controller gyro doesn't have gyro for the Wii U. So I had to literally dust off the gamepad sometimes to do these puzzles. And then when I'm playing on Switch, I'm playing with the Hori controllers, which also don't have gyro. They're officially licensed by Nintendo. So I had to sometimes wait till I got home so I can plug it into my dock and finish the gyro puzzle. And then when you do, it is often as simple as there's a ball in a maze. You have to rotate the maze to get the ball to the other side. And to go through all of that trouble just to do that, or to use the gyro to swing a hammer and knock a ball across the shrine, it sucks. We may talk at some point about our hopes for Tears of the Kingdom. This is like near the top of my list. Get rid of these fucking gyro puzzles. I don't want them.
Yeah, those gyro puzzles were such a nightmare. I ended up cheesing every single one of them. I think on my first playthrough, I did a few legit, like just the way that, or as intended. That's the thing about this game, is I feel like it's actually really hard to cheese. But when we talk about, the physics sandbox, I can explain more my reasoning there. But I did a few of them as intended, where the ball is going through the maze and you're tipping it and you want to make sure it gets to the right spot before it kind of dumps out onto a platform, and then it pushes a button and you can get through the door. But eventually, I just shortcutted most of them because it was just such a pain. And like I said, the first time I played this game was on Switch Lite, and it was really not fun to try to do those on Switch Lite.
Oh, yeah, because if you're rotating to try to get the ball through the maze, then suddenly your screen is at a weird angle, and it's tough to see.
I mean, I don't know if I can explain this in words very well because this is an audio format, but just think like my hands and wrists would be like contorted, and I'd slowly be moving them, be like, and I'm trying to like keep my eyes on the screen, but like I have to bend my wrists backwards because I'm just trying to just get the ball to move just like 1 in-game meter. Yeah, it was, like I said, a lot of these puzzles I can think about examples of shrines that I really disliked. Now I actually tended to really enjoy the combat ones, with the the mini guardians, because, and I think they're divided like, a minor test of strength, a modest test of strength, and then a major test of strength. And those ones I didn't mind because I felt like they were really good practice for different enemies and different weapons. I viewed them exclusively like as combat practice with different weapons and different techniques that I was trying to learn. And I found them to be rewarding in that way. Some of those fights drag on quite a bit.
Yeah.
But I tried to use that to my advantage, right? And some of these shrines were the main reason why I didn't complete my second playthrough, which I wanted to challenge myself by only investing in stamina instead of hearts. And, some of those later challenges, 3 hearts is squat. It doesn't matter how much defense boost you got, you're dead. Right?
Yep. I have heard criticism of Breath of the Wild out there in the ether that it is copy-paste, that it is tech demo-esque, and I don't disagree with that notion entirely, because these combat shrines are copy and paste. I think there's 30 of them in the game, something like that. And they are all exactly the same. The guardian you're fighting might have more health in the major test of strength compared to the minor test of strength. They may have a couple of extra moves that they pull out, but it is exactly the same. Yeah. And so every time I went down into those combat shrines and it popped up, or I saw the layout, because the layout's always exactly the same. And I was like, minor test of strength. I was like, oh, God damn it. They have a ton of health. Once you learn the moves, you should not get hit by them very often. They don't mix up their move sets. And like a couple people whose opinions on games I respect have called this game kind of a punched up tech demo. And I don't entirely disagree with that. I mean, saying that tech demo is like a pejorative, like it's a bad thing. Which if I'm buying a Zelda game, I don't want to buy a tech demo. But when I see that these combat shrines are so copy and paste, and we'll talk about the boss fights later, they are almost exactly the same, each one. And when we talk about the enemy variety, there's like 10 enemies in a 100-hour game. There are certain aspects of this game that are copy and paste. And I think that like the first couple of these combat shrines that I did, I was like, okay, cool, combat shrines. And then I realized it was never going to change. And then I was like, I don't ever want to do one of these again. I'm sick of it.
Yeah.
So we've talked about how the shrines are a mixed bag. We'll say.
Yeah,
there's some that are cool, and I was like, that's a cool puzzle they thought of with the mechanics that they gave me. And then there are some where I was like, I never want to do this again.
Yeah.
So why keep doing them? And the answer is, when you complete a shrine, you get what's called a spirit orb, and you trade 4 of them for an HP upgrade, a heart upgrade, or a stamina upgrade. Those are your 2 main things that you're using to power up. And I think that this game does a really excellent job of setting short, medium, and long-term goals for the game. We already know our long-term goal, which is to go fight Ganon. We have to power up first. So what are we doing in the meantime? Short-term, you're maybe climbing something, or you see a shrine, you need to figure out how to get there. That's your short-term goal, to get there. Medium-term, though, you are often working toward the main quest, I think, working toward these divine beasts. There are 4 of them in the game that you need to go, not need, but should go and free in order to help you on your quest to defeat Ganon. And these are the big Zelda dungeons. If you want to really make a direct comparison, the divine beasts are the temples from the established Zelda formula. And these have the interesting thing where they each contain like 5 mini shrine puzzles inside of a puzzle box. They all have this puzzle box aspect to them, where you're literally manipulating the level. You're turning things, or maybe you are changing where this water flow is going and stuff like that. The divine beasts get a lot of shit out there. I don't think they're good. I think that like if you put this in another Zelda game, it'd be one of the worst temples in that game. But on my replay, I didn't find them as hard as I found them my first time. So there was less friction, but I was still just not satisfied by this.
Yeah, I mean, kind of coming back to this idea of short-term, medium-term, and then long-term goals, I think this is absolutely one aspect where Breath of the Wild shines, right? When it comes to exploration, right? And kind of getting back to this idea of an open world and what should be in an open world. I mean, the game has these established goals for you, and it makes them very clear. And the reward for finding the shrine, right? The spirit orb plus a fast travel point is just too invaluable to pass up, right? And so it's typically, if you see a shrine, you won't skip it unless this is a subsequent playthrough and you know it's a shrine that you really dislike, right? But typically, whenever I saw a shrine, for example, like, oh, great, I can rest up, I can get all my hearts back, I can get a fast travel point, I can get something that's going to be really useful for me when exploring. The other aspect of this would be the towers, right? And this is like the Assassin's Creed towers, right? Where they unlock portions of your map so you can actually see the topography when you're looking at your map. And they also function as a fast travel point. And it's interesting because in the early part of the game, like those towers are just, if you find one, you climb it, and then you activate it. And then as you sort of move away from the center of Hyrule, they tend to be more heavily guarded. Or there's a few that are in like poison swamps or whatever it is, or they're covered in thorns, and so you have to figure out a way to clear the thorns before you can climb them. And I felt like those felt more like the combat-oriented shrines or puzzles, in the sense that, like, here you're actually going to have to use your arsenal to unlock them, right? Whereas as we discussed in most shrines, you don't. But anyway, these short-term, medium-term, long-term goals, I love that the long-term goal is so urgent at the beginning of the game, and then you realize, oh wait, yeah, I don't have to do this right away, right? Like I can really build and work up to this. And then for me, a lot of the game just turned into, like we've discussed, finding these shrines, but also just like traversing the landscape and seeing what it has to offer. Mm-hmm. Like I think when I first discovered that you could find these golems and that they would reward you with a ton of gems, jewels, right? I thought, holy cow, the first time I played this game, I was like, I'm going to go try to find a bunch of these, right? Because they are really valuable, and it's a fight, that it's a different type of fight, and let's just kind of see what we can do. And so I felt like these goals would constantly evolve as I was exploring, as I stumbled across, like, oh, by the way, this, gameplay mechanic exists within the game. That gave me a great adrenaline rush. Let me find some more of this. And so I just love that there is a real fluidity to what these goals could be.
Yeah.
Maybe some of them was just like, hey, I'm going to chop down all these trees and get a bunch of apples, or I want to find these ingredients. I'm just going to go find a pond and throw a few bombs in it and collect 17 fish or whatever it is. Right.
Yeah. There's a real joy to, maybe you don't see a shrine, but like you said, you look at the map and you see a spot that you haven't been to yet. There's a real joy to going there, seeing what there is. And depending on what there is, maybe you get a reward, but part of the reward structure in this game is the knowledge that you used your toolkit or your stamina bar or just your smarts on how to manipulate the climbing or something like that to get there. Yeah. And then, if you want to just kind of chop down all the trees, like you said, and build bridges across rivers or whatever with the tree trunks or the tree trunks, you can do that. So there is a lot of joy to that. So what did you think of the divine beasts?
I thought they were fine. Like, they were so atypical, right? What you've come to expect from Zelda games. And it's funny because it's true. The equivalent of these divine beasts would be a temple. And I'm thinking like Ocarina of Time, for example, right?
Yeah.
But they're just so not. They just don't meet that standard. And so part of me is like, do we put them in a new category? But I don't know. They were just so strange to me because, like, I'm thinking like back to like a Link to the Past or Link's Awakening. When you go into one of those temples, I feel like there's a real threat for your life, right? Like if you're not managing your hearts well, or if you're in a room that has, those fast conveyor belt floors and spikes everywhere, and you're really screwing up your Pegasus boots, like it has serious ramifications, and you've got to be really thoughtful about how you go from room to room. And I felt like the divine beasts, were slow paced.
Yeah.
You'd have the goopy eye thing that you'd have to shoot with an arrow, and then you had a lot of puzzles. And yeah, because so much of Breath of the Wild is already at that pace, it was a bit of a letdown to go into a divine beast and be like, the pace hasn't changed. I'm just doing more intense shrine puzzles.
Yeah.
Trying to manipulate a specific mechanic or utilize certain physics. My second playthrough this game, I honestly just looked up speedrunning tactics to get through. Because I don't know. I think in my first playthrough, I was a lot more generous with them. I think they were still enjoyable. They were new, so I had to figure them out. But the second time playing through them, I just thought, I have to get from point A to point B, and I'm going to have to cross over this puzzle this way and that way. And they were immensely less fun the second time around.
Yeah, the first time I played, I'm kind of the opposite. The first time I really hated these. And then when I replayed just now, I thought they were like not super fun, but better than the first time. And I think it's maybe just because I had a little bit more familiarity. The the puzzle box aspect of them feels like Nintendo exploring the idea of giant puzzle box dungeons instead of like, you know, go in this room, do a mini puzzle, then go in the next room, do a mini puzzle.
Yeah.
Then you find the Zelda item, which lets you complete the rest of the puzzles in the dungeon.
Right.
And then you get to the boss fight that needs that item. This is doing away with that structure.
Mm-hmm.
You get all the items you're going to get in the first 5 hours of the game. So they really leaned into this like puzzle box thing. And it feels like a first attempt at it.
Yeah.
And it's something that I think Tears of the Kingdom should do better. Like if they're not better in Tears of the Kingdom, I think it'll be a massive disappointment to have new ones 6 years later that are not better.
Yeah.
Would be disappointing. So yeah, the divine beasts are really helpful though for your quest to defeat Ganon. Like I said, they're technically optional. You don't have to do them.
Mm-hmm.
I recommend you do them. Not so much that they're going to help you fight Ganon, like the final boss fight. They help you, but it's not like you couldn't do it yourself.
Mm-hmm.
But you do get mechanical rewards. You get extra hearts. You're going to pick up equipment, stuff like that.
Mm-hmm.
And that is a good segue to get into talking about your toolkit in the game.
Yes. And this is great. The last comment I want to say about Divine Beast ties into this really, really deeply where,
yeah,
I mean, you establish like the long running Zelda format for dungeons, right? The first half of the dungeon you do with whatever you bring into it until you get the item, and then the item unlocks the rest of the dungeon. You need the item on the boss. And then in A Link to the Past, one of my favorite games of all time, has this massive problem where that item means squat now. Like once you've defeated that boss, you will never need that item ever again, right? Or in a very rare, like off the beaten path way, you'll need it. And it felt like the trade-off was, okay, instead of having these Zelda items in each dungeon, we're going to give you this physics toolkit, which is the Sheikah Slate. And this is your arsenal that you can use in every single dungeon. Now, I think the pro to that trade-off for Breath of the Wild is that toolkit is invaluable for the entire game. Like those mechanics that they offer are crucial to how you're going to creatively get through Breath of the Wild. Now, and so they never grow old. There's never this problem where it's like, I'm never going to use this ever again. Well, there's probably a need to use it in some capacity later on, right? But the problem, right, is that suddenly each of the dungeons become puzzle boxes, like you said, that are going to feel a bit similar in nature because there's no chief mechanic to shake them up. It's just the same old tools, right? But I think 4 of these I loved, of these 5 abilities.
Yes, and that is a good transition to get into your toolkit in the games. You're not picking up these items, so what are you using? In Breath of the Wild, we have done away, like Jake said, with that traditional structure of picking up a new item in every dungeon and then forgetting about it. In this game, during the tutorial on the Great Plateau, you'll get your main 5 abilities that you're going to use the entire game. Mm-hmm. Link has this magical tablet called a Sheikah Slate, and you pick up these runes for it. So real quick, they are Cryonis, which freezes water into a pillar that you can climb on. Stasis, which freezes things in time and allows you to build up potential energy by hitting it. Magnesis, which helps you move metal objects. And bombs, which are either round or, interestingly enough, cubes for different situations. All bombs in this game are remote bombs. It's a great idea. And you also get a camera. So, yay, camera. So in this game, all of these Sheikah Slate abilities work together with the physics sandbox that Cameron was talking about earlier, along with many other systems for how weather work and how enemies work and how fire works and how wind works and everything like that, to create almost limitless potential for emergent gameplay. And when I talk about how this game is way greater than the sum of its parts, I think it's because of this. The emergent gameplay and the creativity that it affords you is just incredible. To see a situation, think about the tools you have and how they can be manipulated, how they can interact with each other, how they can interact with the world, and just let you problem solve the way that you want to problem solve. This is a game that says yes more than it says no when you try and think of a solution. So I have a couple examples here. Jake, I wonder if you can think of some too. Breath of the Wild was mentioned in the discussion on the show a couple months ago about emergent gameplay. An example. So fire sets grass on fire, as it does. When it lights on fire, it creates an updraft. You have a glider in this game. So if you jump and glide in the updraft, you will fly up into the air. When you're falling, if you pull out your bow, time will freeze for as long as your stamina wheel can hold out. So if you're in combat and you use a bomb in a grassy area, it will light it on fire. You can use the updraft to ride up and get an advantage in combat, all because of the way these things interact. And you can shoot arrows, you can do a plunging attack. It is just a very small but very creative example of how you can use these things.
Yeah, I think this is so remarkable about this game that there's a really strange sense of verticality in how you get above enemies, right? And the fact that they included like the cube bomb, right? The bomb that doesn't roll. That was probably one that I ended up using way more than I thought I would, right? Or I actually ended up using both bombs quite a lot, but like just starting with the cube bomb, there are these different bokoblin fortresses that are in the shape of a skull, right?
Yeah.
And it was really easy to sneak up to them because there's stealth in this game as well, right? You could climb up there, and then I would just like drop a bomb in an eye socket and then just kick it over. And then it would land exactly where I needed it to be. All the bokoblins, they get question marks above their head. They don't know exactly what's going on. They haven't seen me quite yet. Get them all to gather around the cube and then just kablooey, right? Just blow them up and then just create chaos. That was one of my favorite things to do, especially in that context, because the arena that they're in, they can't ever really see you, right? And then just kept creating confusion amongst them until I would just hop in. They're all down at like a quarter health and then just go to town with a sword or whatever it is. So the square, the square ended up being really useful when I wanted really precise bomb placement.
Yeah. I use bombs a lot in combat. There's a lot of, combustible stuff around that you can use your bombs to blow up and get an advantage in combat. This is really, really apparent early in the game before you've powered up much, when you have shitty weapons. And this game at the beginning is harder than any Zelda game I've played except for the ones on the NES. It really reminded me of when I tried to play Zelda 1, and I was like, oh, this is really fucking difficult. Reminded me of that game in more than one way, in Breath of the Wild. When you approach an enemy camp, you're always outnumbered by the amount of enemies there. It kind of brings up my other example that I've used talking about emergent gameplay in this game, where like if an enemy doesn't have a weapon, but it's combat state, they'll try to find a weapon.
Yeah.
If they pick up a metal weapon when it's raining, they will get hit by lightning because lightning strikes metal in this game. It's one of like the hard-coded rules. The way that you can manipulate this, if you can pull it off, like it's a, honestly unnecessary thing a lot of times, but it is fun to manipulate this and say, hey, I wonder if I drop this sword that's about to break, if they'll try and pick it up because I stole their weapon. And then they'll get hit by lightning, and it works.
Yeah.
And it's just like, the game is like, yes, of course, you thought of this. We'll let you do this. And I love it when video games do this. I said it in that emergent gameplay discussion that we did. It's the secret sauce, which makes like a lot of my favorite games, is allowing me to use the rules for how the world works and express my creativity.
Yeah, and this is exactly why I think it's really hard to cheese this game, because the Sheikah Slate gives you all of these tools, and it gives you these hard-coded rules, like the one that you mentioned with lightning, and it says, all right, let's see what you can do. Let's see what you can do with all this, right? And so, for example, going back to those gyro puzzles in the shrines, almost, every time now, if I'm doing one of those, I'll always angle the thing so that the metal ball is in a specific corner facing wherever it needs to go. Glide on over to the puzzle, hop down, hit that thing with stasis so it freezes, whack it a bunch with a sledgehammer, and then as soon as stasis breaks, just watch that sucker fly exactly where I need it to go. And is that cheesing the game? It's not a glitch, and I'm following the exact rules that the game is giving me to accomplish a puzzle, right? And so I just love that Breath of the Wild allows for this type of out-of-the-box thinking. I mean, you're still following the rules of the game, but it's definitely out of the box if we're going to call it like gamer logic of how you're supposed to take down a fortress of bokoblins. There is no one set way. You might find, like you say, there's some combustibles over here. Okay, so I have that to my advantage. Oh, you know what? The wind is blowing this way, or you know what? I've got a Korok leaf. I bet you I could roll a bomb over there pretty easily, right? They all crowd around with question marks above their head, and then bam, my bomb sets off 3 other explosive barrels. And it would be hilarious seeing how sky high some of these bokoblins would go.
Yeah.
They just freaking soar, like across a river, right? Because you're just hitting them with 5 different explosives at any given time. So I wasted a lot of bomb arrows. That was a lot of my playtime was doing that. One of the funniest things I think to do was to use stasis on enemies or on objects that they were trying to use. Because they'd panic, right? And like you said, I love that enemies would respond to how you're interacting with the world. And I just felt like Link wasn't necessarily super powerful. Like you said at the beginning of the game here, right? Like it's hard. You have 3 hearts, you have 1 stamina wheel. You have to be really smart about how you enter combat scenarios. But one of my favorite things to do was just to mess with the enemies. And I always kind of imposed on them that they probably thought Link was some sort of deranged wizard, right? Like who on earth is this freak? Like, where this guy come from, and why can't I use my club right now? And then suddenly he's got a few sword slashes into him, or suddenly his friend is being blown to Kingdom Come because some lunatic with a cube, bomb is sending him off, right? And so I found those moments to be super enjoyable, right?
Yeah, and you mentioned speed running a couple times throughout this game or this episode. The interactions that are possible in this game, like we're in 2023 now. If you see clips of people posting stuff on Twitter, like clips from this game or on the subreddit for Breath of the Wild or Zelda, the stuff that's possible with these interactions between your abilities and the physics system and everything, it's wild how high the skill ceiling is with these things.
Yeah.
Like you could play this with just using things the way that they are, like, quote unquote supposed to be used, and you can fight every enemy camp straight up. It's possible, but why would you not experiment with all these tools that you're given and all of these systems? And like, obviously I find myself more on the basic side of these things than like the Twitter clips I see, but it's crazy how high the skill ceiling is, and like how little it takes to start to discover those interactions for yourself. Like there's the one with stasis where if you see a big rock plate on the ground and you hit it with stasis, you whack it with your sledgehammer to build up a bunch of energy, and then you jump on top of it and it will launch you across the map. Yeah. And sometimes you'll die because why wouldn't you die by doing that? But sometimes you won't. You can use your glider to save yourself or something like that, and travel huge distances in a couple of seconds just because you thought to use your knowledge about how everything works to your advantage.
Yeah, it was remarkable. I feel like in the early days of those Twitter clips, a lot of people were just making tree rockets to get around, especially in the speedrunning community, where essentially what you're doing is you have your woodcutter axe and you're chopping down a tree, and as it's falling, you hit it with stasis so it's at an angle. Very quickly, you swap to something else, you whack it a few good times, and then you hop on the tree log. and then you just rock it somewhere, right? And
Yeah.
I mean, I remember seeing those all over Twitter, and I ended up using that a lot. And I ended up using tree rockets as missiles that I would fire at enemies, right? It's super hard to land it. I am not very good at actually landing my mark with that. But that was just like another example of like, this like little group of bokoblins is gonna panic because there's gonna be a tree just flying straight at them. And I think it's kind of rare because for me, I love to play like stun builds in a lot of games. And here I just went on full chaos. Like I was like, okay, I'm gonna just send all these dudes into a panic. Their health meter is gonna be halfway down, and then I'm gonna charge in and just kind of take them all out while they're freaking out. And I just found so much enjoyment in that because the game would respond like that. The last, I mean, we could talk about the speed running forever, but you mentioned this, like as you're falling through the air, if you pull out your bow and you pull on an arrow, notch the arrow, and you haven't fired yet, time will slow down. And what speedrunners have discovered, they call it the bullet time bounce, where if you time it right, you can actually have that happen. And if you have like a shield on your feet, as if you're sliding on it, you can bounce off of certain objects and go crazy far. Now, there's kind of a lot of button inputs to make this happen. It's not intuitive. It's tricky. And like I've already mentioned, the controls of this game are a little wacky as it is. But if you want to try this out, I would I can't remember the YouTuber's name, but there's a tutorial. And the best way to learn this is at the Temple of Time on the Great Plateau. If you go up to the tower where you first get the glider, directly beneath you is a bokoblin. And you can practice the bullet time bounce and just skip off that dude's head. And
nice.
And just go, I mean, I'm not super good at it. And the few times I got it, sometimes I just went straight into a wall and died immediately, whatever it was.
Yeah.
And then they've developed a technique to do this midair as well, using the two different bombs to give yourself this massive propulsion forward midair. And so watching some of these speed runs, believe it or not, there is a 100% speed run of Breath of the Wild. And this is what they'll do to get across the map quickly is they'll do a bullet time bounce, and then they'll just keep refreshing this essentially midair with these bombs, and they'll just go and go and go. And so, yeah, I don't think we have found within 6 years of this game a limit to the creativity of how you can use this game, like the game's physics.
No, I don't pay super close attention to the speedrunning community for this game or anything, but like, I'll tell you this, like every time I see a Breath of the Wild clip on Twitter, I watch it. And every time I watch one, I'm like, holy shit, I didn't know you could do that.
Yeah.
That's crazy. 6 years later. So
6 years later. Yeah.
Combat in Breath of the Wild is, we just talked about the complexity of all these systems and their interactions and stuff. Combat by comparison is really simple. And in my opinion, not great, especially playing some of the other games that I really like that are combat focused. And honestly, like if I'm thinking back to other 3D Zelda games, it's basically the same, sometimes feels worse if I'm being honest, with a couple of new mechanics on top. Like you can parry in this game and there's a perfect dodge. I parried a lot. I could not do the perfect dodge to save my life, so I stopped trying, which kind of sucks because that's the only way you get like this amazing counterattack is not by parrying, but by doing the perfect dodge.
Yeah, I'm with you there, right? Like if you were to strip away all of the Sheikah Slate abilities and then just focus on combat, mano a mano, right? It's I think you start to see like the limitations of the enemy types, the enemy AI, right? And the different types of attacks that they're doing. And I think the worst combat scenario in Breath of the Wild is essentially when you're, not really, I mean, let me think of it. Let me put it this way. Sorry. Probably the worst scenario is it's you versus like 5 bokoblins, right? And you're waiting for your bombs to recharge. Or you're waiting for an ability to recharge, right? Because they're just kind of spamming attacks at you. The lock-on is a little funky because you lock on by holding block.
Right.
So there isn't, I mean, I found that to be a lot more restrictive than I wanted it to be, especially with like two-handed weapons for whatever reason.
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like spears become pretty valuable, which is kind of rare, I feel like, for, combat and action games, because you can use them with your shield. But yeah, I felt like combat was just weird, actually, when I booted up Breath of the Wild again for the last time before this podcast last night, and I was practicing just like parrying, and the parry timing was just a little off for me. It wasn't used to, like, it's not what I'm used to, like, in Elden Ring by any means, like the timing, or like Hi-Fi Rush, which is a game that I recently finished, right?
Mm-hmm.
I felt like there's something weird going on there. So it's funny, you and I had different experiences, because the Flurry Rush is something that I could pull off really consistently.
Interesting.
And at one point, I was really good at parrying, and that's how I would take down most Lynels, is by parrying them.
Yeah.
But the Flurry Rush, like especially against the mini guardians, I felt like was one that I really had dialed in, and that's how I could do a ton of damage. And like you said, those I think are the two most interesting aspects of combat by far. It's just kind of a shame because like I was like 1-on-1 with a white Bokoblin, which is one of the more beefy ones.
Yeah.
And man, I think he had like one type of attack, which was just like slash wait.
Yep.
And that was it. And so I was like, okay, there's not really much to do here if I'm just going at him with my sword.
Yeah. The enemy variety, I already talked about, it stinks. For a game this long, there's no excuse for there to be this few distinct types of enemies. Even if you're talking about the Bokoblins versus the Moblins, however you say them. It's a tiny dude with a club versus a giant dude with a club. They're still functionally the same enemy. One of them is just bigger. They don't have different attacks. They don't have different abilities. So you fight those two, you fight some bats, you fight slimes, you fight Lynels, which are new enemies for this game as far as I know. These centaur-looking things that are very difficult, but the reason they're difficult is because they hit very hard and they have 1,000,000 hit points. And then when you get to the kind of upgraded versions of those regular enemies, like you said, the white Bokoblins, they're the same enemy as the basic ones you meet in the first half hour. They just have 1,000,000 hit points and they hit really hard. So there's no real challenge to them. Like, I'm not getting hit by those enemies by the time they start appearing. They just take forever to kill.
Yeah.
So when I replayed the game, and I think something that contributed to me playing 40 hours versus 100 is I didn't fight anything in the open world. Like, if I saw a Bokoblin camp, I didn't do it because I knew my reward was going to be maybe some arrows, maybe some rupees, maybe a gem or something. But there was nothing about the combat encounter design that made me think, oh, this is going to be fun. Which is why there's one place late in the game where they take away all your abilities and make you kind of use, it's like your final exam for the game, basically.
Yeah.
And that was great because I was back to square one and I had to use my knowledge. Whereas like when I'm fighting stuff in the world or whatever, I'm just like, maybe I'm going to get a new sword from this, but it's going to take like 5 minutes to kill all these things the same way I've killed all of them before.
Mm-hmm.
It's just not worth it, I don't think. And this kind of gets into like your reward being a sword sometimes, which is one of the game's biggest lightning rods, which is the fact that weapons have durability in this game. And not a lot of durability. Not durability in the sense that like if you use the same weapon for like 15 hours in Elden Ring, it'll break. It's like if you use the same weapon against 4 enemies in Breath of the Wild, it'll break. How do you feel about weapon durability?
Oh man, this is quite the topic, right? And people are still debating this.
Yes.
I think weapon durability, there's a lot of reasons why it's a mixed bag and there are a lot of mixed emotions. Just to give a straight answer, I wasn't too bothered by it because I kept finding enough weapons to keep things replenished, right? Now, I would have had a much more significant problem if weapons were sparse, right? And there are stretches for sure in Breath of the Wild where finding weapons suddenly becomes difficult for whatever reason, right? Or you're like, oh, you know what? It's Bokoblin Camp. Oh, I'm going to clear it out real quick so I just have an extra sword. And then you're rewarded with a gem. And you're like, great, but I needed a sword, right? And so this is a pretty big contrast, I think, with the shrine rewards. Shrine rewards are consistent and they're highly valuable. But like going through all these different camps, very inconsistent. And sometimes you end up with a bundle of 5 regular arrows, right?
Yeah.
And it was like, crap, I wish I would have known that this would have been worth it, right? And so I think, coming back to weapon degradation, I mean, for the most part, I didn't have a shortage, so I wasn't as hot and bothered. However, I think weapon degradation would have gone over infinitely better had there been a very clear path to where weapons were and how you could obtain them. And if they lasted a bit longer, like you said, this is the problem. Like in Elden Ring, 15 hours with the weapon, it might break, right? And then you could repair it, right? Whereas in Breath of the Wild, you can't repair it. I think that is the number one red flag with weapon durability. If you can't repair weapons, right, then you're going through them quickly, right? And just that it's so inconsistent getting new weapons and knowing whether or not a weapon's going to be worth it, right?
Yeah.
I think in terms of just like the overall game design, they were way too skimpy on the number of good weapons in the game, and they were way too plentiful in how many like Korok sticks were just lying around, right?
Yeah.
So I don't know. I feel like the mechanic itself as a mechanic that exists isn't necessarily a bad idea, but I don't think the implementation was super flexible here.
Yeah. I think that the idea of weapon durability in Breath of the Wild is really good. It is throwing a wrench in your plans during combat. Oh shit, my weapon broke. Now what? And I think that this system really sings in the first 5 hours of the game when you don't have an inventory full of other weapons that you can use, and you have to start thinking like, oh shit, I don't have a weapon and there's all these enemies chasing me. So, okay, I drop a bomb, I hit them with the bomb, they drop their weapon, I go grab it. Now I've turned the tide. Those moments are really great, I think. But those moments stop being moments like 5 hours into the game because suddenly you have tons of weapons and you've found lots of Korok seeds and you've expanded your inventory, and you get to a point later in the game where, okay, my weapon broke. I have 20 other weapons. This is not a big deal. And that's even before you get the Master Sword, which doesn't break. So it's good for a while. And then it also brings up this other bad tendency that people have, that I get too, where later in the game, I have a really fucking good sword, but I don't want to use it against anything except for a boss because it'll break. And so I pick up a royal longsword, which is just a basic ass sword. I use it against these random enemies. They take longer because the sword does less damage. And then I get to the final boss fight and I have not used that really awesome sword yet. So it starts out really good and with a strong idea, and then really quickly just completely becomes a minor annoyance. It breaks. I have to switch to a new weapon. I'm never in any danger of running out of weapons again for the rest of the game. You know?
I mean, it's funny because the save file I just booted up like over the past few days, I have 3 super powerful elemental swords, right?
Yeah.
One that does freeze, one that does burn, and one does lightning, right? And I refused to touch them because that exact same thing, right? I knew that they were going to break, and they were going to break way, way too soon. And so I was like, you know what, why not use these other weapons? And then coming back to what, like, I'm kind of just repeating what you say, but just like suddenly if I'm up against a bunch of tanky enemies, well, they became that much tankier, right?
And that's a tendency that other people will say, Dave, break yourself of that tendency, use that sword.
Right.
But the fact is, a lot of these enemies, really hard ones especially, like fighting a Lionel, you will break almost all of your weapons going up against that thing. And okay, so you're saying now it's a resource test of like, yes, can I not get hit by its attacks or can I cook enough food to restore my health and stuff like that?
Mm-hmm.
But also, do I have enough weapons to literally get through this fight?
Mm-hmm.
And it's just not quite what it could have been.
Yeah.
You know, it becomes more annoying than anything.
I think the best part about it, honestly, was that if your weapon it says like, oh, your weapon's a break or it's badly broken. I can't remember exactly what it says.
Right.
Then if you chuck your weapon at somebody, it does like triple damage or something.
Right.
And that, I think, was one of my favorite parts, was like, this weapon's about to break. Great. I'm going to, I'm going to chuck
very
it.
smart by them to let you throw it. And to give you an indication that it's about to break.
Mm-hmm.
So you're like, okay, time to throw this thing and start with something else. I agree. That's a good inclusion.
Yeah, that to me felt really good because I could like mentally prepare to transition, and it does like a huge amount of damage, right? So typically whoever I was fighting, if they didn't die, they were close to dying after I threw a weapon at them. Then sometimes I thought it was kind of funny. It's like, here I have this royal claymore. Let me just huck this real quickly at somebody.
Yeah.
However, I think there are some there are some weapon types that I felt like I hardly used, despite there being like a throwing mechanic, like the boomerangs. Like I rarely use the boomerangs, or if I did, I used them as swords. You know,
same. Yeah. Yep.
And spears. There were some javelins, right, that you could throw, but maybe I can't. Maybe I'm making this up. You'll have to fact check me, but I think throwing your weapon does considerable damage to its durability. Is that right? If it's not a boomerang?
Yeah. I think it automatically breaks, even unless it's like if you hit something, I think it automatically breaks. Or maybe I just didn't throw a full HP weapon, you know? But
right. But it was a risk, right? So as much as I like that mechanic, like throwing it and missing always felt bad. You're like, crap, there goes a ton of damage, and now I have to switch to something else, right? But yeah, I felt like one-handed sword and shield was really my go-to for combat. Just so I could have parries in there, just so I have blocking damage too as well, and also do damage. But like I said, it's impossible to sort of map out where all the one-handed swords are on the map. And so I found myself switching up quite a bit, which I felt was good for me because it's very easy, I feel like, for a lot of gamers to get pigeonholed into one style you like. Like this was my problem playing Hades, right? Love the shield and I love the spear. Hardly tried anything else, right?
Yeah.
And so I did like that the game forced me to be like, all right, try out a halberd, right? And it was actually because of how I liked using the halberd in Breath of the Wild that I actually ended up doing a Dark Souls run where I was like, you know what? I liked halberd in Breath of the Wild. What if I did a Dark Souls run with a halberd instead, right? And so it did kind of rub off me in some ways, and I do appreciate that aspect of it.
Yeah, that's one like defense that you'll hear for the weapon durability system is that it does force you to not get married to one particular type of weapon and use everything that you pick up because they're all going to break at some point. Yeah. So not to beat a dead horse, weapon durability has been discussed a lot. I think we've given what we need to say about that. One more thing about the combat. I brought this up earlier, but you do fight boss fights and mini bosses around the world. You fight boss fights at the end of the Divine Beasts, and you'll find mini bosses around. And these are kind of two sides of the same coin, I think. They are the mini bosses. There's like 4 different types, and you'll fight a bunch of them if you explore a lot. So the first time you see one of those golem type enemies, it's really cool. And the 5th time you find one, you're like, okay, this one again. And the same with the bosses at the end of the Divine Beasts. I just think that they're too similar, and none of them really feel unique. The most unique thing about them is sometimes the arena will have things that you have to pay attention to, like try and not fall down to the floor, or, there's one in a arena full of water and you can't swim forever, that kind of stuff. Yeah. The other kind of really tough enemy that you fight are the Guardians, which are these kind of machines around the world. We'll talk about the sound design here in a minute, but they're scary. They're extremely difficult early game. If you don't have that parry timing down, parrying the Guardian lasers is incredible. And then that feeling gets extended into some of the boss fights when they shoot lasers at you too. But the Guardian fights are all the same as the last Guardian fight, you know? And so I talked about it with those combat shrines, but the boss fights, the mini bosses, the tough enemies out in the field, once you fought one Lionel, they're all the same. It starts to get old, and I have to fight the Guardians because they'll kill me if I don't fight them, because they shoot lasers at you. But for the rest of them, like if I find one of the Cyclops mini boss out in the world, I didn't fight it because I've already fought 4 of them. I don't need to fight it, and it's not super fun, and it's exactly the same as the last one. And it's just kind of like one more time where it does kind of feel copy and pasted. Like you couldn't give this one a different attack from the other one, you know?
Yeah, I get that. The mini bosses, I agree in that, like, if you look at them like an individual case study, like I like the Golem, I like the Hinox, I like the Lionel, I like the Guardian, right? Yeah. But when, for example, you're going through Hyrule Field, right? And there's just this like 7 Guardians. Like you look through across the field and you can count them up 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and you're like, crap. Do I have to take the long way around, or do I have to fight all of these? And sometimes at the same time. Now, I will say though, parrying a Guardian laser is immensely satisfying, right? Like,
yes,
I think, in terms of, it's not up there with the Mikiri counter in Sekiro, right? That's probably one of my favorite, most satisfying like combat maneuvers in video games. But man, it's up there. Like parrying a Guardian laser is up there. Like you said, we'll talk about sound design in a second. I think that's a huge part of that experience, right? But yeah, I mean, like the Hinoxes, for example, I always saw them like after the initial like excitement of fighting this new enemy type. I always saw them as like a resource dump, right? And that's kind of what these mini bosses turn into, right? Is okay, I know with the Hinox, I'm going to get a bunch of like monster crafting parts that are really high quality. If I fight a Golem, I know I'm going to get a huge amount of jewels or gems here or whatever it is. And which is kind of a shame. A part of that is I feel like you can't avoid it because that's just how video games are, right? But I agree that like, for example, there's one Hinox. It's like just west of central Hyrule. It's like up in this pond. And I remember finding, like looking on the map, and I was like, oh, there's got to be something in this pond right here. I'm going to go check it out. And so I climb up there and I see it. And I was like, okay, it's a Hinox. Okay, like I'll do this fight, you know? And so despite how much fun I think it is, like we've talked about several times, we brought up just like being able to like get from one place to another, and it's exciting. You're like, okay, I climbed here, I did this. And then sometimes the mini bosses, unfortunately, we would just be like that moment of, oh, this is my reward. Dang, I was really hoping for a different reward here.
Yeah. I think one of those mini bosses is one of the worst rewards you can find. I would rather find a Korok every time than one of these mini bosses, 100%. I guess the last thing about gameplay before we get into talking about the music and sound is the cooking and the crafting in the game. Yeah. You do not find potions, and you often don't find like hearts around the world like you might in another Zelda game. What you do is you find crafting materials and you find food. So instead of finding a heart, you'll find an apple. And if you eat the apple, you'll recover 1 heart. But if you cook with the apple, you will make a baked apple, which restores more than 1 heart. And this extends pretty deeply with lots of different ingredients, lots of different recipes, and you can make elixirs out of monster parts and stuff like that. And this is something that other games have started to copy. Another game I covered on the show, Eastward, directly said that they took their cooking system from Breath of the Wild, a very similar type of thing. So how did you feel about the cooking? Did you dig this?
It's funny you bring up Eastward because when I first played Eastward, it's immediately what I thought. I was like, okay, this is taken straight out of Breath of the Wild's book.
Yeah. And to their credit, they were like, yeah, we took that straight out of Breath of the Wild. So
yeah, they were very open about it, which is always nice, right? Yeah. It's funny because the first time I played this game, I actually rarely skipped the cooking jingle because I liked it so much. But after like 20 hours, I was like, okay, I've listened to this 1,000 times. I need to skip it now, right?
Yep.
I think you're right in that like a lot of games are like, hey, Breath of the Wild has this really good crafting system, right? And I think in a lot of ways it does have a really great crafting system. I think it's super easy to find ingredients. This is why I will, die on the hill that Breath of the Wild does not have an empty world, because ingredients are abundant, right?
Yep.
For food, even for monster parts. And it even makes, killing a bokoblin or going into a bokoblin camp that much more enticing because you can get monster parts out of it, right? Even I really disliked the bats, right? But I was like, you know what? I'll even kill some bats for some monster parts right now. I think one of the good things about this is that some of the monster parts were relatively like reducible in the sense that like you just needed you needed monster parts. You don't necessarily need these specific ones. Now, of course, like different monster parts will produce different effects when you're making elixirs. Because that's what you use monster parts for, and then you use, edible ingredients for different meals. And so I would say by and large, I did enjoy it. Now, I do wish it was a little more streamlined in the sense of like, so I can more easily predict, okay, if I make this meal, how many hearts is it going to yield? Is it going to give me these specific stat boosts? And I get that there's like a recipe that you can look at. But I wish it was just a little more straightforward, that I didn't have to look at a recipe to kind of figure out exactly what I was going to get when I crafted some things. The dubious food I think is hilarious, right? Like,
yeah,
you make a food that doesn't work with the game's coded recipes. Well, you get a piece of crap and it's worth one heart. Like I thought that was funny. And I think it was a funny reward every time I tried to cook something new and it sucked. So overall, I think I enjoyed it. I thought it was a good way to get buffs. And it was wild. You could get like up to like 15 minutes, I feel like, of, heat resistance and things like that. This is the last thing I'll say is that this is one of the few moments that there is a relatively noticeable no baked into the game. And it's that you can't stack effects infinitely. I feel like you could really break this game. And so I do agree with that decision. But sometimes it'd be a little frustrating where it's like, you know what? The foods I have here all give cold resistance, but I need heat resistance here. And I'm going to have to end up eating 2 foods to get all the health I want back plus the status effect I want. So, it was fine. It wasn't too big of a deal. But sometimes I'd run into that where it's like, well, I'm wasting food here.
Yeah. It's interesting you brought up this as a response to people who say the open world is empty, because I agree with you. And this is something that a lot of game designers have started doing in the last 10 years, is putting crafting systems in their games, because crafting ingredients is an easy way to put treasure out in the world.
Yeah.
It's much easier to put a tree full of apples somewhere instead of thinking of a unique reward for exploring to that place, which is not to say that apples are a bad reward, because in this game they restore health, and you need that because especially again early in the game it's tough. And when I went into a divine beast, I would prepare, or if I am going to go fight a Lionel, I need to prepare for that fight. I need to cook a bunch of food and kind of get myself ready for it, and that feels good. Battle prep is fun for me in video games.
Yeah.
So getting a bunch of food that gives me a bunch of bonus health or restores my stamina because I really want to climb up that mountain and see what's on the top. Stuff like that is really good. So we talked about the treasure earlier of finding a shrine or finding a Korok or something like that. What's also really rewarding to go somewhere and find a bunch of hardy truffles. And you're like, I can make some really badass food with this. Always feels good.
Yeah, I huge agree with that. Or typically for Lionel fights, especially my first Lionel fight, if I found a trove of iron shrooms, which I knew would boost defense, I was like, okay, I'm going to spend the next 3 minutes and I'm going to scour this patch here and get all the iron shrooms I possibly can. Yeah, and I think that's how Breath of the Wild does this crafting mechanic well, is because ingredients are plentiful. that to me is a huge boon. To compare it, I mean, just because Eastward's on the mind, I did plenty of cooking in Eastward, but I didn't feel like ingredients were plentiful, right? And so
no, not really.
So when I made a meal, right, it was like, I think a boss is about to come up. I just, the telltale signs. There's a checkpoint right here. You can restore your health here. There's a cooking station here.
Right.
I'm like, okay,
yep.
Something big is coming up. The game's preparing me for. I'm going to cook all my meals now. Whereas in Breath of the Wild, I felt like, okay, oh, look, there's a stable coming up. Great. I know there's a place I can cook. As I've been sort of walking through the world, I've probably picked up 60 different ingredients. Let's take a few minutes to cook. Or it's like, oh, look, this stable is right next to us pond. Let's just go get a bunch of fish, and then I can make a bunch of fish, meals right here.
Yep.
So I found it to be really well done, and I hesitate to think of an example of a game that I feel like has done something that has implemented crafting in an open world quite the same way. I would say like in Elden Ring, this exists for sure, but I hardly touched the crafting in comparison to like the cooking in Breath of the Wild, for example. It was so much more beneficial and necessary, I think.
Yeah, just to compare those two games, Elden Ring to me felt like you're crafting for your consumables. It's solving the problem in that game that I have in other games where I don't want to use my consumables because they're finite.
Yeah.
Elden Ring solved that by letting me craft my consumables, but not for health and stamina, because the Estus flasks of Crimson Tears are finite in that game. In this game, you're crafting for your health, your defense, your stamina, etc. And I can't think of another open world game that feels as good to craft stuff, because I'm the type of person where if a crafting system is extraneous and not valuable, I will not do it.
Yeah.
I don't like crafting unless it's valuable to me. There are a lot of linear games where crafting is very, very good, like in The Last of Us, stuff like that. But in an open world game, again, The Witcher 3, I don't craft shit in The Witcher 3. There's no reason to.
I was trying to think if you could craft in The Witcher 3, and I've beat that game.
Yeah, you craft, you don't cook, but you craft weapons and stuff like that.
Right,
You can craft weapons. I don't do any of that. I'm going to find a better sword in 5 minutes.
Yeah.
So in Breath of the Wild, it's great. It's another like feather in this game's cap, I feel like, just to say like, hey, they solved how to make crafting valuable in an open world. Everyone, this is something you should steal. This is great.
Yeah, and if I were to give my reasons why I think crafting works so well in Breath of the Wild is 1, ingredients are plentiful. 2, ingredients are always useful, right? Some ingredients clearly are more useful than others, especially when you're making specific foods or elixirs, but you can always dump something extra into the pot, right?
Yep.
And then finally, I would just say like the products, like the actual things that you craft have noticeable benefit to gameplay, right?
Yep.
Whether that be some sort of resistance, attack boost, huge attack boost, restoring heart, like it was very easy to define and see how exactly a food was going to help me. You brought up the example of The Last of Us. The example I would throw in there is like a Plague Tale. In a Plague Tale, I would go out of my way to find, those levels are very linear, but I would definitely go out of my way to explore some of the, trickier parts of those levels, because I was like, if there are crafting resources in here, they're going to be a massive boon to how I'm going to finish this level and then go through subsequent levels.
Yep. In a linear game like that, they can finely tune how many resources you get and assume the power level that you're going to be at a specific part in the game, or prepare you for a specific encounter. In Breath of the Wild, it's open, so they chose to err on the side of like, let's just let them have as many ingredients as you want.
Yeah.
You will find so many, you might run out of stuff, but like, hey, go look around for 15 minutes. You'll find a shitload of mushrooms and stuff to make a bunch of more food.
Yeah.
Kill some animals, get some meat. You'll be fine. Catch some fish. It'll be all right. So
yeah,
let's listen to some music. And then when we come back, we'll touch on the last part of the non-spoiler section. This is a beefy non-spoiler section today. Talk about the music. So we saved music for last in this non-spoiler part because this game has a reputation of it kind of giving the backseat to the music in contrast to other games in the series. Music in this game is composed by 3 people who have the principal credit, Manaka Kataoka, Yasuaki Iwata, and Hajime Wakai. I hope I'm pronouncing those half correctly. Music's super important to the Zelda series. Anyone who's a fan of The Legend of Zelda will surely point to the music as one of the reasons why, I feel like. This game is really long and you spend a lot of time out in the field, and I think it makes a really wise choice of really backseating the music to let the fact that you're out alone in nature take the forefront. And then when it's time, the music really roars back into the scene, and it makes those moments when the music picks up have a lot more impact, I think. Whereas other Zelda games will have really recognizable songs that you would associate with different parts of the game.
Yeah.
This one will just have moments where it's, I remember when I stepped out of the Cave of Awakening and the music swelled up and it was this amazing moment. And I remember in Hyrule Castle how that level has music and it's incredible. It makes a bunch of these memorable moments, but in its own way.
Yeah, I totally agree. I love the music here. I still regularly, there's some YouTube video, it's like an hour of chill music from Breath of the Wild that I put on while I'm working. I mean, I was a huge fan of the decisions that they went with here. And they went really creative in some of these arrangements. You know, there are some tunes that are super well known, for example, just in Zelda, right, across the franchise. And halfway through like a song, you won't even recognize it's that song until later. So I think stripping it down to a piano was a fantastic decision. So much of the game's soundtrack to me is just also orchestrated by the crickets chirping or like cicada buzzing, you know, or the breeze running through grass, just as much as the, you know, piano keys sort of quietly tinkling along in the background. But like you said, the range of emotion in all the different songs here is immense, and it's immensely powerful, I think, to contrast sort of those peaceful mushroom picking moments with fighting a guardian, which which I think is just A+, you know, just top tier when it comes to music and creating a real sense of fear of I'm gonna die right now, right? Especially when you're mushroom picking and then suddenly you hear, you know, that like quick chirping of the guardian lock onto you, and then the music rushes in and you're like, I am gonna die. I am not prepared for this fight, you know? I was just trying to get mushrooms right now.
Yeah, and it's worse when you don't know where it's coming from. When you're climbing a tower and suddenly that music kicks in, you're like, "Oh my God, where is this thing? I am in danger." You know, it's really excellent. The sound design, of course, like the Guardian sound effects are creepy. We talked about that parry. When you parry something, you get a great sound effect, super satisfying. And then the environmental sounds, like you talked about too. So when you're out exploring, there's no music. Maybe you get a few piano keys every now and then. But what you do get is the wind rustling like through the trees, or animals, or when a storm rolls in, you'll get that. And it's fantastic.
Yeah. Yeah, I really love that. It really helped, I think, with immersion in the game for sure. Just because, I mean, I love the outdoors. I love being on mountains, for example, just hiking. And I love those moments when you stop for like a bit of a trail mix or whatever it is, where you don't even hear your boots hitting the path anymore, right? All you hear is just the wind kind of going through. It's this wonderful, peaceful moment that really envelops you, I feel like, in the environment. And I feel like Breath of the Wild, with this artistic decision to really scale back music and exploration, did a lot. I think it really, really helped sort of immerse you in the natural world of Hyrule. Yeah. So I really, really agree there. But yeah, the Hyrule Castle music, just to talk on this without, you know, saying any spoilers.
Yeah.
Probably one of, I mean, this game uses music beautifully as it is, but man, going through Hyrule Castle is such a music like trip. Just going is so beautifully done, I think, and it really hits all the emotional notes of what it is to be in Hyrule Castle. But also, this is, I think, the music tying into environmental storytelling, where the music, I think, beautifully replicates what has happened to Hyrule Castle.
Yes. It's 100%.
Especially as you go through and you're like reading through some of the history logs there. And this is the final thing I'll say, because I know we're not spoiling yet, but we're getting close to that territory, right? Just the way that the music sort of accompanies what is happening and what you are learning as you're in Hyrule Castle, I think was just so remarkably done.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we're not spending a ton of time talking about music. We waited until almost the 2-hour mark of this podcast to talk about it. There's less music in this game. It's not at the forefront like it is in Ocarina of Time or Link's Awakening or something like that. But it's not to say that it doesn't do an incredible job at what they wanted from the music and the sound design.
Yeah.
So I do want to give it its props. Now it's time at the end of the non-spoiler section, to answer the question, who would you recommend Breath of the Wild to?
I would recommend Breath of the Wild to anybody who wants to play one game for the next 4 to 6 months.
Yes.
I mean, it's funny. I mean, Dave and I, we have this problem because of just being a podcaster about video games, especially because we do weekly episodes dedicated to specific games, which the downside to that is that we don't necessarily get to play games exactly how we want to, right? Maybe you do a better job of pacing yourself than Cameron and I do, right? When it comes to getting through games. But I would say, speaking for myself here, not for Dave necessarily, I do not represent the majority of gamers at all in terms of how I play games, because I'm always thinking about deadlines and podcast episodes and how I want to talk about this. And with some specific games, it's like, hey, if we don't put out an episode on this quickly, no one's going to care, right? The Breath of the Wild, I feel like, is one of those games that, as we mentioned, 6 years later, people are still finding discoveries in this game. If you are playing this for the first time, just let it be the only game you're playing, right? And let yourself have those discoveries and share those discoveries. There's still a really strong community that is so in love with the exploration of Hyrule in Breath of the Wild that it is very easy to be connected with a lot of people. And I just think, I recommend this game for anybody who's looking for an open world game, somebody who doesn't really like survival, because survival is very light in this game. And if you want to just throw yourself into a single game, then Breath of the Wild is the game for you.
Yeah. Yeah, I echo that. The way I get around podcasting and deadlines getting in the way of my gaming is that I don't schedule an episode until I'm ready to, and I usually finish a game several weeks before we record. So I beat Breath of the Wild like 3-4 weeks ago, and I also record episodes several months before they air. So that's my process. But you're right. I am not a typical video game player either, because I'm always playing lots of games. So even if I'm not like stressed for time, like I need to beat Breath of the Wild because I'm recording in 2 days or something like that, I'm playing Breath of the Wild alongside other games. And then there's another game coming out next week that I really want to play. So like I need to make time for that too. And for the average video game player, they're not playing 4 games at the same time. They're playing 1 game. And I think, like you said, this is an excellent game for someone like that, or for someone who plays 1 game a year or 2 games a year and just kind of like plays a little bit in their free time because they have better balance of their hobbies than I do. This is a great game for that. So that's an excellent observation there. I recommend Breath of the Wild to anyone who would possibly enjoy an open world game. It is as simple as that, because this is the ideal for an open world. It is a game that is fun to explore and rewarding to explore, because if exploring and traversing is not fun in an open world and you're not rewarded for doing that, then why the hell are you playing an open world game?
Yeah.
Why are you making an open world game if it's not like that? And I think that, like, if someone wants to play their first open world game, Breath of the Wild, incredible for it.
Yeah.
If someone is tired of checking things off of a checklist in the open worlds. Breath of the Wild does not have that unless you're going to try and do all 120 shrines and get all fucking 900 Korok seeds. So yeah, easy recommendation for most people. Unless you're like, I don't have time to play long video games and I don't like open worlds, then don't play Breath of the Wild. It's a long video game, has an open world. Everyone else, like, I really like, I know there's been a lot of individual elements throughout the episode that both you and I and Cameron also talked about where we were like, yeah, this kind of sucks. But the total package, when you talk about the experience of playing it, is, like, to me, magical, I think. And this episode is going to come out about a week and a half or so before Tears of the Kingdom, hoping that it doesn't get delayed in the meantime. And I can't wait to see what they did because this was such a magical experience and they've had 6 years to work on it and iterate and get more creative. I can't wait.
Yeah. It's funny because even in our predictions episode in our podcast, I mean, we talked about how Tears of the Kingdom will be critically acclaimed, right? We have other concerns with it, but that's, for another time. But I think you're right in that, they've given themselves lots of time with this game, with the sequel to Breath of the Wild. And as much criticism as the three of us have sort of leveraged against Breath of the Wild, I think it's relatively indisputable that this game has a really significant legacy in gaming, particularly in open world games. And that really cannot be ignored. And so maybe that'd be my final person to recommendation, right? Is that if you're looking for a game that people are going to be talking about 20 years from now, play Breath of the Wild. It's never going to leave the gaming conversation.
That's a good point. If you're the type of person who has not played Breath of the Wild, but you value playing the games that, like, literally change people's, like, hobbies and things that they enjoy, like it did for me. I like to go on, like, the gaming history tour sometimes and say, like, I never played Metal Gear Solid. I want to see what it is. If that's Breath of the Wild for you, what are you waiting for? Like, get in, see if you like it. The worst that's going to happen is you don't like a video game, and that's fine. There's people who don't like Breath of the Wild. Most of them inhabit your pre-order bonus Discord server, apparently. But it's cool. But I do think it's something that should be tried.
Yeah, I think this game still stands. My last comment. I think this game still stands the test of time. I think it still holds up. Will continue to be, one of the best open world games ever made. And I think what makes it that way, just as my last comment, is it's that physics sandbox. It's the playground, right? Nintendo found the fun, and they found the fun by taking these elements that existed, like, in indie games and in other places, and added it, like, into their Zelda and their, like, AAA Nintendo way. So thanks so much for having me on the show. Sorry I got to jump.
Absolutely.
Little housekeeping before the spoiler wall here. This might be the latest spoiler wall in Tales from the Backlog history. Got a lot to talk about here. Jake, I'm going to put the links to the pre-order bonus podcast down in the show notes, but is there anything else, anywhere else, that you would like to direct people for the show?
I mean, we are most active on Twitter and on Discord. And so the Discord is really free to anybody. We're pretty lax in there for sure. When gaming news kind of comes up, that's when people get buzzing and the Discord gets hopping. But when things are slow, the Discord's slow. So just, this won't take over your entire life for sure. So I mean, and it does, I actually really appreciate that about the Discord. We have a great community there, although it is the running joke that really nobody there likes Breath of the Wild. So if you don't join the Discord after listening to this episode, that, no one can blame you. Like I said, at PreorderCast, I actually run that Twitter. We're on there very actively. And then finally, we do have a Patreon. We have 2 tiers. We have a tip jar, and then we have a $5 tier where I put out weekly episodes. Indie impressions are really short. They're 15 to 20 minute episodes just on indie games that I'm playing or that I've beaten. And then we put extended episodes on there as well. And then Cameron, with the rare AAA impression, will post something up there as well.
Nice. Yeah, we did one of those indie impression episodes about Chained Echoes, which went out to the public, everyone could listen to that episode,
Yes.
but it is hosted on the Patreon. So if you like Chained Echoes, that is a good place to go, because Jake and I talked about the story, had a great conversation there.
Yeah. And that was longer than 15 minutes.
Yes, it was. Much, much longer. For Tales from the Backlog, same stuff as always. Our Discord server is always going on. There's lots of people in there talking about games and movies and all kinds of stuff. Another great community. We would love to have you come in and talk about Breath of the Wild. Breath of the Wild is a game that if you've played it, you have some sort of opinion on. So I think people are going to be talking about it this week. And then Tears of the Kingdom coming up. If you want to jump in and talk about how you're liking Tears of the Kingdom, that's a great place to do that. Also have a Patreon on this show. $2 per month minimum will get you bonus episodes, voting on games upcoming on the show, and a bunch of other cool stuff. Also, feel free to check out my other show, which is called A Top 3 Podcast. Every episode is a top 3 list or a draft or something fun like that. That is a much different vibe from this show. So I think it's a lot of fun. We'd love to have you check that out. So Jake and I are going to take a break. When we come back, it's going to be the full spoiler talk for Breath of the Wild. All right, Jake and I are back, and we're talking spoilers for Breath of the Wild. And this is interesting. We spent over 2 hours in the non-spoiler section. I think this is going to be one of the short in air quotes, because it's me and it's this show, spoiler sections. Because it's like, I personally don't think, I think there's a couple of like really cool moments that are great to see and experience for yourself, but it's not like you already know where the story's going.
Mm-hmm.
You know you're going to beat Ganon at the end, and there's just not a whole lot of like traditional spoiler stuff for the game. So anyway, let's talk about the story and where it goes. You pick up a lot of stuff via lore notes. You can read notes. People leave them in their cabins or in Hyrule Castle at the end. Mm-hmm. The other way that you get the story, and this is an active thing that you have to go seek out, is by going to these locations that will trigger Link's memory. And you'll watch a little cutscene flashback of something that happened in the past. It's usually Link and Zelda together before the calamity. So these are optional. I think there's like 16 or 20 of them, something like that.
Yeah.
Did you do these?
Not all of them.
Yeah, me either.
I mean, part of it, I feel like, is you're given a snapshot of the world, of where you can find the memory. And if you find that, like, the actual location within the world, and then you'll see, like, a glowing indicator of, like, hey, if you stand here, then a cutscene will happen, and you'll be able to, like, relive a memory.
Yeah.
But the game is massive, you know, and I felt like with most of the game's exploration, you could look for a shrine and you could sort of predict where a shrine would be, or you could look at the topography of the map and predict, okay, if I go over to this thing, I bet something interesting is happening here. But with the memories, you're just given a screenshot. And yes, there's some like really strong landmarks in some of them, but some of them I was like, listen, it's probably in this third of the map. I'm not going to go like trudging along, right, like specifically looking for this. If I stumble across it, hey, fantastic. Maybe I'll keep it in the back of my mind that like, oh, I'm going to this area of the game. There might be a memory around here. I'll keep an eye out for it, but no more.
Right. Yeah. It's the more difficult version of finding specific locations, because you're not finding the location in the photograph. You're finding the location the photograph was taken from.
Yes.
Which not only do you have to find that landmark, but you have to get that that same angle on it. So when I just by myself without a guide tried to find these, I struck out almost every time. It was just really hard.
Yeah.
And I found my most recent playthrough, I found like 5 of them, but it was just by accident. I would just be walking somewhere or I would see like an interesting landmark or something. But literally sometimes by accident, I would walk somewhere and be like, oh, glowing spot on the ground. Oh, memory. Okay, we'll go check that out.
Mm-hmm.
So I think those memories are interesting. Some of them are pretty emotional as a Zelda game can be, I feel like. The ones that I thought were most interesting were the ones when they're building the Guardians, because the Guardians were part of the Hyrule Army's efforts against Ganon, and they immediately became corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
It's, as robot stories go, right?
Right.
So it's kind of cool to see a little backstory of them like building the Guardians and people being like, yeah, I don't really trust these things. And someone else like, no, it's fine. It'll be okay.
Mm-hmm.
So that was kind of cool. I didn't do a ton of these. We don't need to spend a ton of time. There's a couple other memorable things. I also don't have specific divine beasts to talk about. Number one, because we talked about them. The puzzles are not super memorable. The bosses are not super memorable. The stories surrounding the divine beasts, like you meet a hero, or you meet a leader of one of the villages of the 4 races. You talk to them. They tell you about the hero who died fighting the calamity. You wrestle back control of the divine beast. You kind of talk to the hero's spirit, and then that part of the game is over. So those are like fine, story wise, but not super memorable, I don't think.
I honestly think like the heroes associated with each of the divine beasts, like the actual story themselves was okay. I think what it did for world building was much more impressive, right? Where you kind of look back 100 years ago of like what happened during the calamity, what the hero's role was in it. And then very rarely in these types of stories do we actually get stories of failure. And these are 4 heroes that lost. They died.
And Link did too. Link lost.
And
he died.
Yeah, Link lost, right? I mean, and I think the one that probably resonates, or not resonates, but the one that's most memorable to me is Mipha's story from Zora's Domain.
Mm-hmm.
There's always been like a little like, okay, is Link involved with this Zora or not, right? And so they bring that back for Breath of the Wild with Mipha. And, hers, I felt like her loss felt the most tragic to me because her father and her little brother survived her, after she died. And so when you get to Zora's Domain, there's hurt, there's a lack of emotional resolution for having lost Mipha in this battle against Ganon. And then Link shows up without any memory of it. And some people get a little miffed about that. And so like the actual story of loss itself, I thought was okay. Right. But like, in repeating myself, but what it did for the world building, what it did for me as a player thinking, oh, Zora's Domain, there's some people that are actually really divided about who I am as a person and as a hero. And I'm going to have to kind of shoulder that a little bit as I'm going through this story. Now, I'm going to say this because it's behind the spoiler wall, but did you play Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity?
I played the demo for it and I hated it.
So they took what I think was a beautiful world building moment and they just kicked it in the nuts. Like, I think Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity just, and we've been critical of the overall story, but I really like this story of loss and, partial recovery and different things emerging from this loss and from this failure. And I feel like Hyrule Warriors Age of Calamity just slapped it all across the face. Which is
because it's a prequel, right?
It's a prequel. It takes place 100 years when the calamity happens. And so I went into it fully expecting like a Star Wars Rogue One moment, right? Yeah. Where you have this really bittersweet, but ultimately tragic sacrifice that we've all known about as audience members the whole time through. We just get to live it, right? With those characters.
Yeah.
And Hyrule Warriors just really, really pulled the rug out from any sort of emotional weight there. So I'm sounding very bitter because I'm still bitter about it. But like coming back to the Divine Beasts and the spoilers of this game, Mipha's story and I think her loss and how that impacted Zora's domain was done really well in Breath of the Wild. Mm-hmm. And when you get to the other three stories, they're just not, there isn't the same emotional depth, right?
Yeah.
You have new leaders who are sort of like descendants of these heroes of the Divine Beasts, but I just don't think there's nearly the same level of emotional impact with their stories as there is with Mipha's.
Yep, agreed. So it is a good point that this game kind of puts on Front Street right at the beginning that you lost. And Link, to this point, Link doesn't lose. Every single game is Ganon appears, you go up and you fight Ganon and you win, and that's the end of the game. But not in this game. I guess like you lose in the middle of Ocarina of Time, but that's not the end of the game. So
right.
That is a cool aspect of the story for sure. And it's really all I have to say about the story until getting to the final boss. So a couple stops along the way that I thought were very memorable. I mentioned this earlier without getting into specifics, but if I had to make a top 3 moments or things in Breath of the Wild, the Great Plateau is great. Hyrule Castle is great. And then the other one would be Eventide Island for me, which is the island where they take away all your stuff. And it's a challenge to, like I said in the non-spoiler part, final exam for the game. Do you understand how to use everything available to you to defeat this challenge?
Eventide Island, I did it my first playthrough, and it was a struggle for me to go back to 0, right?
It's tough, yeah.
It is tough, and it is way tougher than I thought it would be. But
because real quick, like you can't go there until you have a ton of stamina, or at least you know how to craft like insane stamina potions. So by the point you're able to go to Eventide Island, you're powered up. You have a bunch of cool weapons, probably. You have a bunch of food that you've cooked to kind of make yourself not invincible, but for all intents and purposes, invincible. And then Eventide Island is like, nope, back to 0. 3 hearts, no weapons, no clothing, nothing.
Yeah.
So it's tough. I agree.
It was really tough. It was a struggle for me to complete it. When I did it, it was immensely satisfying.
Yep.
And so I think it was a total triumph, right? And just getting that out of the way, I don't plan on doing it ever again.
Interesting.
Like I thought it was a really satisfying experience, but for me, I feel like going back to it and knowing how I play games when I replay games, I tend to be more impatient. And that, I think Eventide Island, it is a final exam, and it does test your patience and your willingness to really utilize nothing to accomplish a lot, right? Like you have to use a lot of ingenuity and creativity to get through it. I think maybe I'll take back the absolute. Maybe I'd go back and play it, but I definitely have to be in the right mindset of looking for a specific type of challenge, because I do think it is a challenge. But I'm super glad that it was included, and I'm super glad that I did it, because there's a really immensely satisfying payoff when you do complete it.
Interesting. Like, so on this replay, I was looking forward to exploring, but specific things I was looking forward to the castle and Eventide, and I could not wait. And I would go back there and try it and be like, okay, I don't have enough stamina yet. I need to come back after I do a couple more upgrades. Like I was raring to get back to this because it is a test of like, do you understand how to use the runes to the best of your abilities? Do you understand all of those other interactions? They set up so many ways for you to be creative. So like there's camps of enemies on the island and you don't have enough weapons to just fight them straight up.
Yeah.
So do you know how to beat them without that stuff? And I cherish that kind of gameplay challenge to like use what I know about the systems and how they interact and everything. It's really great. Now, one thing I was not looking forward to and I actually didn't do my second time, was Terrytown, which is the most famous side quest in Breath of the Wild. So before I say why, I was not looking forward to this. Did you do Terrytown, and how do you feel about it?
I really like the idea of Terrytown because I think the idea of it does contribute to what I think, Breath of the Wild's cool world building, right? Okay, a brand new town is going to be constructed. Here, we can see how life goes on in the wake of Hyrule's destruction. But it is the craziest grind fest, I felt like you had to do so many steps and gather so many things to make it happen that I just didn't complete it.
Same. My first time, I thought it was cool. Like you said, you're building a community, you're helping to heal society and stuff like that. And I thought that was cool. And like, there is some emotional content in the Terrytown story. Mm-hmm. But like you said, it is a hellacious grind to get the materials to do it. And I didn't finish it my first time. And then when I was replaying it, even with the idea of like, I would like to talk about it on the podcast, I was like, I'm not doing all that collecting for this. And then I forgot to look up like even how the quest line ends, because apparently I don't care enough to see what happens at the end. But a lot of people seem to like it. I don't get it. It seems like if you're playing Breath of the Wild for 200 or 300 hours and you're going to accumulate the resources to finish the quest, then yeah, maybe there's something rewarding at the end and you'll feel great about what you built, but not me. Like I could not care about it.
There is a speedrunning category of Breath of the Wild. It's one of my favorites. It's the dog percent.
Okay.
There are 16 dogs throughout Breath of the Wild where if you feed them enough, they will lead you to buried treasure.
Okay.
And the buried treasure actually won't spawn in the map until the dog is happy, right? And it takes like 2 to 3 apples to feed a dog and make it happen. And one of the dogs is in Terrytown. And so in order to complete that category, you have to complete Terrytown, which is the only way that I've actually seen Terrytown be completed. And so I love watching it. Like, it's one of my favorite categories of Breath of the Wild speedruns. I love watching it. And it's kind of funny because when they were routing it, right, they had to route in the quickest way to complete Terrytown. And I'm sure Terrytown percent is its own category at this point, right? Because it is known for being such a grind. But I just love how, like, okay, this is a cute, fun little mechanic. If you make a dog happy, and they're mostly at different stables throughout Hyrule, they'll lead you to buried treasure, right? And that's a cool, fun thing. And then to have one of those dogs locked behind Terrytown just made me laugh. I was like, okay. And so in order to actually do this, and I haven't checked the last I was following that category more seriously, I think it was like a 2-hour run. I think the category was just under 2 hours.
Jeez. It's a crazy grind. And that's all I have to say about Terrytown. If you are a fan of Terrytown, listener, I'm very happy for you, but not for me. Jake, is there anything you want to talk about, like spoiler-wise, before talking about going to Hyrule Castle?
I don't think so, and that's just kind of the thing. Like, it's hard to come up with to think of a really strong list of a bunch of spoilers here because wait a second. I mentioned earlier that I would bring this up in this section in particular. Yeah. And that's the Yiga clan.
Oh, the hideout.
The hideout.
Yeah.
There's one section of this game I can say, full chested, that I hate.
Yeah.
And it is the Yiga clan hideout stealth section. It is such a monkey wrench into what the rest of the game is, right? It's everything I dislike about stealth games, and it must be completed in order to get the Thunder Helm, I think it's called, right? For the Gerudo Desert Divine Beast. So you have to do it, and it just drove me absolutely bonkers. The good things to come out of that, the silver lining, is that there's a ton of resources in there.
Oh yeah, you're set for Mighty Bananas for the rest of your playthrough.
For the rest of your playthrough. And it's like one of the best ingredients to boost attack, I think. And you get like 50 to 60 of them in there. You get a ton of gems. You get what I think is a pretty funny gimmick boss fight.
Yep.
With the Yiga clan leader. But it's it's
one of the best boss fights in the game. Like straight up.
It is so funny because it's true, you know, we couldn't mention all this because it is a relatively big spoiler, but like you actually do get like enemy variety. You get like a very, I feel like, traditional boss fight as well.
Yep.
And it is very much its own boss fight. And the Yiga clan leader, Koga, is that from Pokemon? I'm blanking on his name. Anyway.
Koga is from Pokemon. So it might be Hoga.
Koga is from Pokemon.
Yeah.
Freak. I can't remember his name. But anyway, it's another moment where I think the writers were pretty funny, right? Like, but I feel like mechanically, in terms of gameplay, that stealth section is such a monkey wrench into this slow paced, wonderful exploration game. And then suddenly I have to do stealth. And if I get caught, I get sent back to the beginning of a section.
Yeah.
And you can't fight your way through. My first playthrough, I tried so hard to brute force my way through that, and I just could not.
Yeah. It's kind of an adage at this point talking about stealth games, but a stealth game is only as good as what happens once you're seen, you know? So it's why like I played Metal Gear Solid 1 and I didn't like the stealth because once you get caught, you're dead basically.
Yeah.
But stealth games that I do like Dishonored and Deathloop, immersive sims in general, when you're playing stealthy, Prey, you guys covered Prey on your podcast. I played stealthy in Prey, and then once you get caught, it's game on. It's a different type of game. But in this, once you get caught, you just get sent back to the beginning, and it sucks. And it's really easy to get caught. It feels like the rules that have been established for stealth up until this point don't really apply anymore. Like they're way more strict about what you can get away with. You can't stealth kill the enemies because they take way too much health. You can kill them, but it's really hard. You would have to like try to cheese it, I feel like. So what it effectively turns into is you just have to be perfect at stealth. And the way that you do that is by picking up the bananas and dropping them in places to get guards to turn their back. But it's kind of fiddly. You can't throw items. You can't throw bananas. You can only drop them in front of you. And it's just, it sucks. It's the worst part in the game as far as a like scripted thing that you have to do. But the silver lining, like you said, is the boss fight is good at the end. It is a traditional Zelda puzzle type boss fight. He has a gimmick. You need to figure out exactly how to counter what he's doing, as opposed to the Divine Beast boss fights that are just like, learn their attack, learn which one you can parry. This one has like a puzzly aspect to it, and it's really good. So I'm glad you brought that up because I'll take the opportunity to shit on that hideout section because it's awful.
It is, there's really not much more I can say, but I could say the same thing about how much I dislike it over and over again, right?
The good part, the other good part, very faint praise again, is that it's very short. Once you complete it, you realize it's like 2 rooms, and then you're at the boss. But the act of getting through those 2 rooms sucks so bad that it feels like it's 20 rooms.
It takes so much longer. And a part of me wonders if it was, if they designed it thinking that it would be a lot easier or a lot simpler than it actually turned out to be. I think you're right that like the stealth in there feels antiquated. All you can do is distract, and you can't even throw the item to distract. You have to be crouching, you have to drop the banana, and then you have to exit, and then it buys you some time to make it to the next part of the maze. If it had been optional, it would be better because I wouldn't have had to do it. Like, I think it would have been worth it for the boss. Like, I totally agree there. And the other silver lining is that the amount of resources in there are freaking, like, there's a ton. I remember going back and doing it a second time, actually, with a guide. And the guide pointed out, like, there's so many gems in there. Now, I originally pulled up the guide because I was like, let me get through this as painless as possible. But I happened to pull up a guide that was like to 100% all the items in there, which was super worth it. But terrible section. Oh, man.
Yep. Going from a terrible section to what I feel like is the best level in the game, the best section in the game, like an unqualified win for the game, is going to Hyrule Castle. So again, you can do this whenever you want, but it's really up to you. Like, when you feel like you're ready, it's time to go to Hyrule Castle. So for me, it was like, I did all 4 of the Divine Beasts, and then I spent more time exploring because I was having fun. And then I had the feeling like, okay, let's go end this. And this, it starts by, you need to find a way into the castle because you can't just like walk through the front. It's guarded super heavily by guardians. And like, unless you're a pro, you can't fight 6 guardians at the same time. So luckily, there's a lot of different ways to get into the castle grounds. Like, you can go in, you can try to glide, up to the entrance. You can use your Zora tunic and go up some waterfalls, which is how I usually get into the castle. This, like, just starting from the beginning, it's kind of like distilling down all the choice that you've had for how you tackle a bunch of the obstacles throughout the game. Now they're building an entire level with all of that choice into it. And it goes, once you're in the castle, that choice continues. You can walk the paths and fight all the mini bosses and explore all the rooms, or you can just climb the walls and ride the updrafts up and really kind of skip all that stuff. Total freedom to approach it the way you want.
Yeah, I love it. The first time, and now that I'm thinking about it, I've actually done Hyrule Castle more times than I've actually played the game. Because I'm thinking about all the different ways that I entered. First time I entered in, I ended up gliding in just from a high point in a cliff nearby, and ended up like landing in some of the wall, and like ended up climbing up into the dining area, which is skipping quite a lot, I feel like, of what's actually available in Hyrule Castle. And man, the second you get in there, like, you're gliding in, and I feel like you have 3 different lasers, guardian lasers honed in on you. I mean, the adrenaline kicks up, and it is so much fun, I feel like, to sort of navigate those halls and navigate the enemies in there and read all the different lore books. And the Princess Zelda's diary in there, I think, is super fascinating, and what she has to say about what was happening to her before the calamity. The second time I went in was through the moat. There's a back entrance, right? It's like a boat launch, and there's actually a shrine in there. So it's nice to have the fast travel point that's like right there. Now, if you enter in from there, you start like down in the dungeons, which I think is another super cool area of Hyrule Castle. And I think it's one of the few unique versions of the Hinox, the Stalinox, it's like the skeletal knight version of a Hinox.
Yeah.
There are very few of those in the game, and one of those is in the dungeon. So I remember like coming up through the dungeon and seeing that thing and being like, holy crap, something new. This is super cool,
Yeah.
He's got the same moveset pretty much. But anyway, it was exciting, and then I remember trying to just like go through the front and just getting absolutely shredded. Like, there's no way this is going to happen. But a lot of the times that I went into Hyrule Castle, and now that I'm thinking about it, I did this so many times to go in, explore, and like plunder, and then come back out, right?
Yeah.
but most of the times was just kind of gliding into a new part of the castle, with a bunch of guardian arrows ready so that I could shoot all the floating helicopter guardians down, and I could actually make it to the castle. But yeah, I loved it. It's like it's the only level, I feel like traditional level or dungeon maybe in the game. And it feels like it really stands apart from the rest of the game in that it is really tough, but it is extremely accessible in how you want to take down Hyrule Castle and then later Calamity Ganon.
Yeah, absolutely. To kind of go further with that, this feels like the only level in a Zelda game that doesn't feel like a dungeon. It feels like a real space that you're exploring. So one of my favorite things about a lot of, we've mentioned Elden Ring lots of times. Well, you're exploring castles in Elden Ring and they kind of feel like real castles. They don't feel like video game levels in that way. And this feels like that. It feels like a real castle. So one of my favorite things about immersive sims is exploring living spaces. And so again, Prey, because you guys just did that. That doesn't feel like a video game level. It feels like a place where people live and work. And that's how Hyrule Castle feels too. Because maybe you'll pop in through a window and be like, oh, I'm in the kitchen right now. And then you go out down the hall and you're in the grand dining hall. And then you climb up a spire and you pop in through a hole and you're in Zelda's room. And Zelda's kind of study quarters and stuff like that. It feels like a real space. And I cannot overstate the joy and video game fun that I have going through Hyrule Castle. After me talking about how underwhelmed I was by the divine beasts, to the point that even in the spoiler section, I don't have anything to say about them really, but Hyrule Castle is so fucking good. And it's tempting for me because the game auto saves you right before you fight Calamity Ganon, or it might auto save you even before you go into Hyrule Castle. I can't remember.
It'll do an auto save before the boss. I know because after I beat the game, it puts a star in the save file where you've beat Ganon,
right?
And then but
you can go back and just kind of I did that my first time. I remember beating the game, but this being I want to go explore more because it's a huge level. You can miss a lot in there, and it feels
massive.
It feels like, obviously they put resources and brain power into the divine beasts because they're puzzle boxes. They designed them, but it feels like they were in their design meetings, they were we have to make Hyrule Castle. This has been your destination for dozens of hours, right? We have to make this payoff worth it. And they nailed it. It's so good. Yeah,
I totally agree with that. I mean, the resources alone that you get from there are just incredible, right?
Yeah.
And from what I understand, that is the only place you can get the Hylian shield. Link's classic shield is in Hyrule Castle. And it is one of the few non-Guardian shields that can parry Guardian lasers. So, that reward, being in there as well as, just really top-notch weapons just throughout there. And with a game with weapon durability, that means the world, right? Where you can go in. But what I also love about that is that it makes it very possible to not have a lot of save points. I mentioned, there's the one shrine that's underneath the castle down where the boat launch is.
Mm-hmm.
And there are different areas where you can cook throughout Hyrule Castle, but that thing is just chock full of supplies and resources to enable you to continue exploring and finding new nooks and crannies. I really love that. Also, that game has, that area has 5 different Lionels, and you can almost do a mini boss rush where you're just fighting Lionels back to back.
Yep. Tons and tons of stuff. And we kind of hinted at it before. We talked about how great the music is, but now we can talk about why. So you mentioned how the music reflects the emotion and then the theme, the story of what happened to this place. it's reminiscent of Ganondorf's music in Ocarina of Time before you go try and fight him, kind of that organ, but it sounds corrupted in a way. And then every now and then, as that music is playing, you get these like bits of familiar Zelda melodies and motifs coming back in just for 1 bar or 2 bars or something, to kind of show you how there's a struggle happening here between light and dark. And sometimes the dark is winning and sometimes the light is winning. And like from that perspective too, it like gave me goosebumps when I was playing, like when Zelda's lullaby would start playing for a couple of measures and then it would go away. And then it would be back with that scary organ, you know. It's like I cannot compliment this enough.
Yeah, I mean, just a contrast of like the scary organ versus the piano out in the rest of the game, right? Mm-hmm. Where the organ and piano, obviously, they're 2 instruments that share a lot of DNA, but they can present emotions so differently, right? And I think there's a really big artistic choice here where the piano out in the wild is supposed to sort of represent like something that feels really natural and free flowing, right? Whereas the organ feels like something that's really oppressive, really overwhelming. And that contrast and like just the outside world in Hyrule Castle and the music, I think is done so well. I had the same thoughts about like Zelda's Lullaby, right? The music in Hyrule Castle is the one moment where you will start picking out all the Zelda music that you're very familiar with. There aren't sort of weird, sparse, abstract arrangements. Things are really straightforward. I remember reading somewhere once, somebody pointed out that the low on heart beeping sound from like 2D Zelda games will actually show up in some of the music as well, right? To sort of, it heightens that sort of stress that we have, you know, baked into us from those older Zelda games that we've played, right? So I think it's really wonderful music because it gets the adrenaline flowing, but without being like raucous at all, you know? I mean, it's just like this very broody, oppressive organ. And I just think that it works so well to communicate the mood of the castle.
Yeah, 100%. And so all the while you're going through this, you're experiencing this struggle, and then you get to the final boss. You get to Ganon, who is in this weird pus sack when you first find him. But then you fight Calamity Ganon. It's a 4-phase boss fight. The first phase, if you did all the divine beasts, they shoot their lasers in and they wipe out the first phase of the boss, which is like appreciated, but like, why couldn't you do that on the last phase? Like the third phase, when I actually need the help, I can take down phase 1 of a boss fight. By definition, it's the easiest part, but they destroy it. Phase 2 is just a regular fight, very reminiscent of the divine beast boss fights. Phase 3, he's invincible, like climbing on the walls and stuff. The way that I did this was I parried the lasers. I don't know if there's another way to beat this phase. This is the 3rd phase before you go out in the field, if you're playing along.
Yeah, that's how I remember doing that phase as well, right? Which is so interesting because you can get through the majority of the game without parrying, with the exception of the Guardians. I mean, you could take down a Guardian without parrying their laser, right?
Yeah.
But if you do parry their laser, it makes those fights significantly easier, right?
Yeah.
But yeah, this boss fight, I thought it was kind of fine. I do love how they incorporated the Divine Beast help in order to like have some continuity with the story and how like your decisions have meaningful, you know, impact.
Yeah.
If you do all 4 divine beasts, then they will help you. You know, maybe the help isn't the best or most appreciated, but I mean, hey, they did something, right? And it was worthwhile to do it. You get to skip a whole chunk of this boss fight. And so, yeah, I thought that was really cool. Before you get to the field, I think the Ganon fight is better than any of the divine beast, you know, when Blight Ganon fights.
Without question.
Right?
Yeah.
But it didn't feel like a traditional Zelda fight to me still, right? Not like the Yiga clan leader fight did necessarily. I don't know how you felt about this boss fight. Like, I don't think it was a bad boss fight. I think it was worth it to be as long as it was because I wanted a really big payoff and I wanted Ganon to feel like he was really tough because that's how everybody's talking about him. But
Yeah.
like, I guess comparing with like other video games, not my favorite final boss fight.
Yeah. Final bosses are weird. They're often either too difficult and therefore not satisfying as like a conclusion to the game, or they're just kind of like, the final boss fight in a lot of Zelda games is not like super different from any of the bosses you've done in the dungeons up until that point. Like there's a couple of them that stand out as being really cool. Ocarina of Time, again, that final boss fight felt very cool.
Yeah.
This one, I agree. It's better than the Divine Beast fights because it's a souped up version of those. He's got more moves than those, more phases. It feels like the most powerful thing you're going to fight, for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But it's not the hardest thing you're going to fight. I found every Lionel fight to be more difficult than Ganon at the end. And I don't think I feel great about that realization. But what it does do, I think, is it is better. It is a very good final boss from a narrative perspective where you freed the Divine Beasts. The Divine Beasts were originally constructed to help you fight Ganon. You assumed control of them again. Now they're helping out in the fight. Zelda is involved in the fight eventually. And it does feel like you're fighting this really dangerous creature, even if it's not the hardest thing you're going to fight in the game. And then you get to the set piece at the end, which is, from a narrative perspective, it's cool. From a gameplay perspective, it's underwhelming, I think. So phase 4, Ganon transforms into this giant kind of bull form. You go out into a field. It's not the real field from the game. It's a new level you go into. And you're on horseback, which is always enough of a struggle to control that it's like, it doesn't feel great. Zelda gives you this bow of light, and you shoot the glowing spots on the bull. But the key thing about it is that it's so hard to get hit by the attacks because they have the slowest windups possible, that this is not a challenge in the slightest. It is basically a cutscene. And I don't like that about this. I wish that this were more difficult.
It's always a risk to switch up mechanics mid-fight, I think, for any boss. And then to do it for a final boss also, right? I mean, if you had to learn parrying to sort of get through the main Ganon boss fight, well, were you practicing archery on horseback throughout the game, right? Because if you weren't, suddenly this fight is going to feel kind of bad. And my first time taking this down, it took me a while to figure out, okay, hold on. I have to move the horse and then I have to do motion controls if I want to really land these arrows. I mean, you don't have to do motion control. Eventually, I learned to do motion control and use the thumbstick simultaneously. But it's always a risk. And when making that risk, it was clear, like you said, that the designers behind this fight thought, okay, we have to make this more of an interactive cutscene because we're making such drastic changes to what was going on, right? Like previously. Yeah. So I understand that decision. I think I totally agree. As a set piece, super cool. Like narratively, super cool. Ganon has historically turned into some sort of warthog bull in the past. Why not now? Right. And so I thought all that stuff was cool. I thought it was a cool spectacle. I kind of wish you can do this, but I kind of wish that you didn't get the horse. And maybe Ganon didn't have to be so big, but I kind of wish that you just had this massive Hyrule field arena. It was you on your own 2 feet, and you had to figure out how to take down this giant warthog bull thing. Now, of course, this is just me speculating. I don't know how that would actually pan out. But really what I mean to say is that, sure, you could do this fight without the horse, but the horse is super dependent here. And I don't know. I just kind of wish I could have used my arsenal the way that I was really comfortable with, which was Link on his feet fighting the final boss instead of Link on a horse.
Yeah, the one, like the defense for that is that before all of the divine beasts, you had to do some kind of like set piece action thing to calm them down enough to enter the divine beast, or like lower their defenses or something. And there's a couple of them that are similar to this. One of the reasons that I think this sucks is that we didn't talk about this much. We didn't talk about this at all, but you have access to horses the entire game, but I never used them because you're just on the move way too often. And like, if you take a horse up to a mountain and then you climb up the mountain and then you jump off and glide somewhere else, your horse is gone. You can't call it back to you. So like, I never used horses. So the few times that like I have to, it didn't feel great, including this. But I really just got the feeling during this last phase of the Ganon fight that they didn't want you to lose. They wanted this to be a guaranteed win. It is so easy. And if you do get hit, it doesn't hurt you that much. I don't want to say like no one's ever going to die against this, because someone might.
Right.
We've all, got things that we're better at than others, or some people may have a reason why this is more difficult for them. But this is so much easier than any other boss fight or phase of another boss fight in like the same, the final boss, that to have this be the last phase, the climactic moment, you still get the climactic moment of firing the final arrow, but it's like, it didn't feel earned as much as it could have, because it was just so easy.
Yeah.
And like, not in a pro gamer type of way. Like this, I got hit on purpose just to see what it would do. And it took like 4 hearts off. Like, it's just programmed to be easy. And it just kind of like, you get over it because that final shot is cool. And then you see the ending of the game and stuff, but it could have been more of a challenge to overcome. Like this is really similar to the final boss fight in Twilight Princess.
Yeah.
And that was a lot of fun, being out riding on horseback in the final boss of that game. And this part was like cool spectacle, but not fun from a gameplay perspective.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I really don't think you could lose. I mean, like you said, sure, it's possible to lose that fight, but I totally agree in that like fighting a Lionel is just like infinitely more difficult, right? Because if a Lionel hits you, it's going to hurt like heck. And you have to be really stocked up on stuff. Otherwise, you're going to be totally screwed. So yeah, I'm kind of coming back to the same summary, right? Really cool spectacle. I loved looking at it. I like how it transitioned into the final cutscene. I love that Zelda showed up. This very much took me back to other Zelda games where Zelda shows up at the very end. She has a unique ability or power that she has to use as well to help finish the fight. And so I felt like they incorporated that well again here. But yeah, cool to look at.
Yep. So even though the final boss fight kind of ends in a kind of unsatisfying way, you do get to see the ending after this, and Zelda and Link reunite. And I cried during the ending because this game means a ton to me. It's not the narrative content that made me cry. It's just the culmination of this journey in this game that means a ton to me in the like my life and hobby of playing video games and now doing a podcast about it. Obviously, I care about games, and this is one that left just an incredible imprint on me. So, Jake, thank you for joining me for this episode for 3 hours. And thank you to Cameron for giving us as much time as he could on this busy day. I appreciate both of you guys. This has been an awesome conversation. From the very beginning of this podcast, I knew in my heart I would do Breath of the Wild someday. Just had to be done. So again, I appreciate you guys so much for coming on and talking about it with me.
Yeah, I mean, hey, we are super glad that you picked us to do it. I mean, we're fans of your podcast, obviously, and so to be able to come and share and talk about Breath of the Wild with you has been an honor. It's been a ton of fun. And the funny thing is 3 hours doesn't even give this game justice. We didn't even mention horses until the very end, right? And think of all the other things that we sort of missed as well too. But yeah, thanks so much for having us on.
Yeah, this is another one where I can confidently say, like, hey, if a 5-hour podcast wasn't unreasonable, we could we could probably go for another couple hours. So
yeah.
Thank you guys again. I will say one more time for everybody listening, if you made it this far, thank you very much. Please go check out the Pre-Order Bonus podcast. It's a podcast I listen to all the time. Got turned on to it recently, and I'm really glad I found it. Their episodes are significantly more bite-sized than this episode here today. But again, go check it out. Very quality show. And again, just appreciate everybody listening. Thank you to the patrons of this show and of the Tube Network. I appreciate you all. And tune in next week for the next game to come out of the backlog.